The elder walked in without knocking, a bamboo stick in his hand, and began to beat him. But the teenager on the floor didn't scream. Not because he was trying to be a hero. He heard light footsteps behind the door and understood. If he screamed, she would come in. And then the elder would turn his attention to his wife. But this teenager had been dead for 7 hours already. A completely different person had awakened inside his body. The first thing Daniel felt was cold. The stone floor pressed into his cheekbone and smelled of dampness. His head was splitting as if someone had driven a nail into his temple and forgotten to pull it out. He opened his eyes. The world swayed into a blurry blur. He looked at his hands and didn't recognize them. Thin, pale, knuckles worn down to the flesh. The hands of a teenager who had been beaten long and often. He clenched his fist and realized this body wasn't his. Nothing here was his. A stranger's memory flooded his mind. A name, Seo Dae-Hyun, 17 years old, an outer disciple of the Seo clan's side branch, married, status lower than that of a servant. His meridians were empty. 7 years of trying to open the first seal. 7 years of failure, 7 years of beatings. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Okay. He didn't know how it was possible, but he'd been working with other people's bodies for 20 years and knew the first rule by heart. Don't panic. Assess the damage. Make a plan. And he assessed it. The 2 lower ribs on the right side responded to each breath with a dull ache. A crack. His neck could barely turn. His knees were swollen. A sharp pain shot through his lower back when he tried to straighten up. This body wasn't just weak. It had been systematically broken down. And just then, the elder walked in. So Chang-min, his cousin, the one who'd beaten him every day for 3 years straight. He looked down at the boy and muttered that the useless vessel was lying there like a dead fish again. 7 years of feeding and watering him, and it's all for nothing. Even a horse learns something in 7 years. The first blow to the shoulder. Dae-Hyun's body jerked, curling into a ball. A defensive instinct. Daniel caught him halfway. The second blow to the back. The bamboo whistled and struck between his shoulder blades. And that's when the strangest thing happened. Daniel didn't scream. He heard light, quick footsteps outside the door, and the donor's memory kicked in instantly. It's her, I-Seul, his wife. If he screams, she'll come in. She'll come in and switch her focus to him. She won't hit him. Worse, she'll humiliate him. She'll say that the heiress of a dead clan married an empty vessel and isn't even worth that much. And Daniel silently took the 3rd blow. The 4th. The 5th. The elder ran out of breath first. He snapped that tomorrow was the external students' review, and if this trash disgraced the clan again, it wouldn't end with just a beating. He spat on the floor next to her head and walked out. The footsteps behind the wall froze. Then they quietly retreated. She had been standing there the whole time, listening, and she left only after making sure the beating was over. Daniel sat down, leaning the back of his head against the cold stone. So, the world of martial arts, spiritual energy, clans, some kind of medieval East, a teenager's body ravaged by starvation and beatings, and a wife who, as far as anyone could recall, was the only one in 7 years to show even a shred of concern for this kid. Daniel smirked. He'd seen this before, not in a world of swords, of course, in cheap gyms on the outskirts of San Jose, where coaches yelled at 12-year-olds for not being able to do 30 push-ups. Instead of asking, "Have you eaten today? Have you slept? Does anything hurt?" No, just yell louder, hit him with a stick, wait for results, and then be surprised when there aren't any. He got to his feet. He staggered. There were almost no muscles left in this body. According to the donor's recollection, the boy ate once a day, a bowl of watery porridge, sometimes a piece of dried fish. 7 years on such a diet and daily beatings. It's a wonder he was even breathing. Daniel walked around the tiny room. A mat, a thin blanket, a jug of water. No table, no chair. The room was worse than a doghouse, although technically he was the husband of the Songhwa clan's heiress and the son-in-law of the Seo clan. Fragments of memory surfaced. The Songhwa clan had been wiped out 5 years ago. I-Seul had been hidden in the temple. Then the Seo clan took her because the marriage contract had been signed even earlier. A political deal. She is the heiress of a great clan. He is a nobody from a side branch. But a contract is a contract. Now she lives 2 hallways away, with a sword under her pillow, with a mourning ribbon in her hair that she hasn't taken off in 5 years, with a husband who is a burden, whom she has to defend from his own relatives. Daniel sat down on the floor and began to list the problems. First, the body. Critical lack of mass, chronic injuries, 0 muscle tone. He needs protein, sleep, and exercise without axial compression. Otherwise, his lower back won't hold up. Second, status. He's at rock bottom. There's nowhere lower to fall, and that's the only upside. No one keeps tabs on trash. Third, he doesn't know the rules of this world. He remembers from someone else's memory that cultivators channel chi through meridians, that seals are unlocked through training and elixirs, and that each seal multiplies the body's strength. He remembers it like a failing student who's memorized a textbook by heart. He knows the words but not the meaning, because Dae-Hyun's body is empty. The meridians are silent. Chi does not flow. For 7 years, the elders tried to awaken even the slightest spark within him. To no avail. An empty vessel. A defect. Trash. Daniel lay down on the mat and let the foreign memory flow freely. A 10-year-old boy stands before the elders. They probe his meridians and shake their heads. A 12-year-old boy receives his first blow with a stick. A 14-year-old boy stands before a girl in white with a mourning ribbon, and he is told she is his wife. She looks at him, her eyes empty. No anger, no contempt, no hope. A 15-year-old boy lies on the floor after being beaten. The door opens. She enters silently. She places a small bowl of rice and a piece of wet cloth beside him. She leaves without saying a word. The 16-year-old boy tries to escape. They catch him 2 hours later and beat him so badly that he can't get up for 3 days. And every night, she leaves water and rice. Silently. Daniel opened his eyes and realized he was crying. Not for himself. For the kid. For Seo Dae-Hyun, who had lived 17 years in this body and was no longer here. Who had never heard a kind word except for the silent offering of rice at the doorstep. Who had run not from his wife, but from the pain, and who had been brought back into that pain. Daniel wiped his face with his sleeve. Enough. He'd cried his fill. Now it was time to work. For 20 years he'd been getting people back on their feet. A teenager with anorexia whose mother wouldn't feed him. A wrestler with a torn cruciate ligament who'd been told his career was over. A 14-year-old girl who came to the gym because her stepfather beat her at home. He knew what to do with broken bodies, and with broken people. All it took was time. The night was fitful. He woke up in pain every hour. Toward morning, he sank into a deep sleep and was jolted awake by a sound. A steady, rhythmic thud from the courtyard. He dragged himself to the narrow window. It was getting light out. A girl was standing in the courtyard. White training clothes, a mourning ribbon, a sword in her hands. Songhwa I-Seul was practicing her form. Strike, return, strike, return. The same movement over and over. Daniel began to count. 15 minutes later, he reached 40 and she hadn't stopped. Half an hour later, he reached 80 and her left hand began to tremble. 40 minutes later, on the 100th repetition, both were trembling. Her form began to falter. Her shoulders rose toward her ears. She compensated for her fatigue by tensing her trapezius muscles. A classic mistake. But she kept going. 120. 140. The sword was shaking violently. Her legs were buckling, but she didn't stop. And then Daniel realized. She wasn't training. She was punishing herself. Every morning. 200 repetitions of a single form until her muscles gave out completely. No warm-up. No rest. driven only by anger and guilt. This isn't a method, it's slow suicide. She held on all the way to the end by the window, exactly 200 repetitions. Then she hung from the sword for a minute, breathing heavily. She straightened up. She sheathed the blade. She wiped her face with her sleeve, and she left. Not a single emotion on her face. Daniel sat down on the floor. 7 years of zero progress. Empty meridians. The elders beat him with a stick because they have no other tools. And every morning in the courtyard, his wife destroys herself with 200 reps without any system whatsoever. And then he felt a twinge in his chest, barely noticeable, as if something inside had stirred and then frozen. He froze. He listened. Silence. It must have been his imagination. He stood up and took his first step into his first day in a new world. The day began with porridge, watery rice porridge in a clay bowl with nothing else. The maid set the bowl down by the threshold and left without looking back. Daniel sat down on the floor and began to eat. The porridge was bland and watery. Zero protein. Carbohydrates were minimal. If this was his only meal of the day, it was no wonder that Dae-Hyun's body was nothing but skin and bones. He finished eating. He licked the bowl clean. Every calorie counted. Then he carefully stood up and began a physical examination. He always did this with new students. Assessment of joint mobility. Ankle. 30 degrees of dorsiflexion on the right side and no more than 20 on the left. Knees. They creak when bent. Slight swelling on both sides. Hips. Internal rotation on the left is almost zero. Lower back. Protective spasm of the quadratus lumborum. Thoracic spine. Kyphosis. Shoulders hunched forward. Head tilted forward. The typical posture of someone who has become accustomed to bracing against impacts. The diagnosis was simple. The body was in a state of chronic adaptation to stress. Every muscle, every joint, every nerve was operating in defense mode. There was no question of any strength training. First, the brakes had to be released. Relax what was tense. Turn on what was turned off. Feed him. Let him sleep. At least 6 months before this body would be capable of anything. Daniel left the room. A long corridor with stone walls, several doors, a light at the end of the corridor. He walked slowly, memorizing the layout. The donor's memory provided a general map, but Daniel was used to trusting his own eyes. The estate of the Seo branch of the family was small. The main building, a training yard, outbuildings, a small garden, stables. Beyond the wall lay the town of Taegyeon. According to the donor's memory, it was a trading hub on the border between the territories of the Seo clan and the Baek clan. Nothing special. A market, stalls, taverns, small-time mercenaries and hunters. He reached the training yard. It was empty. Morning training hadn't started yet. Wooden swords of various sizes hung on racks. Circles for sparring were marked on the ground. In the corner of the yard stood stone blocks for strength exercises. Daniel walked over to the blocks. The smallest one looked like it weighed about 20 kilograms. He tried to lift it. His hands were shaking. With great effort, he lifted the block 5 centimeters off the ground and immediately put it back down. 20 kilos. This body couldn't lift 20 kilos. In his past life, he'd worked as a foreman with a crew of 140 men. Voices. He turned around. A group of young people in gray clothes was entering the courtyard. Outsider students, about 10 of them, aged 15 to 20. They saw Daniel by the stone blocks, and several of them smirked. An 18-year-old guy with a broad face and a short haircut stepped closer. The donor's memory recognized him. Park Tae-yeon, a second-year outer disciple, first seal, one of those who regularly humiliated Dae-Hyun. Park asked if the empty vessel was trying to lift the stone again. He said that last time the guy had almost fallen, and it had been very funny. Daniel looked at him. In his previous life, he'd worked with troubled teenagers. Park Tae-yeon was a classic example. aggression directed downward in the hierarchy. He beats up those weaker than himself because he, in turn, is beaten up by those stronger than him. Nothing new. Daniel replied that yes, he'd tried, but it hadn't worked out. He said it calmly, without provocation. Park blinked. He'd expected fear or anger. Instead, he got a neutral statement of fact. It threw him off for a second. Then he grunted, nudged Daniel with his shoulder as he walked past, and headed toward the others. Daniel didn't linger. He returned to the hallway and followed the donor's memory to the part of the estate where I-Seul lived. Her room was 2 hallways and 1 turn away. The door was closed. He stood there for a minute. He listened. Silence. She was either sleeping after her morning workout or had gone out. Daniel walked on. Behind the estate lay a backyard that gave way to a small patch of wilderness with trees and a stream. It was quiet here. He sat down by the stream and began to think. He needed a strategy, not for a day, but for months. Step 1. Food. 1 bowl of porridge a day was killing this body. He needed protein. He needed fats. He needed calories. There were 2 options. Either get his rations increased, which, given his status, was nearly impossible, or hunt for food himself. The stream. He looked at the water. Small fish darted about in the stream. Small, but fish is fish. Protein, fat, calcium from the bones if cooked right. He spent an hour and caught 3 finger-sized fish with his bare hands. A meager catch, but it was a start. Step 2. Sleep. Dae-Hyun's body slept at most 4 hours a night, partly because of the pain, partly because of anxiety. Fitful sleep. Cortisol through the roof for demand. His muscles weren't recovering because his body thought it was in danger, and it was right. He needed to get at least 6 hours of sleep. How? Relieve the underlying pain, reduce anxiety, find a way to relax the nervous system before bed. Breathing. He knew the technique. A slow exhalation twice as long as the inhalation, activating the parasympathetic nervous system. The simplest thing that apparently no one here had used. Step 3. I-Seul. She was the key to everything, and she didn't know it. Daniel didn't yet understand exactly how, but that morning, standing by the window and watching her perform the form, he felt something. A stirring inside. A connection, intuition, or just a coincidence. He didn't know, but he knew something else. Her training regimen was monstrously structured. 200 repetitions of a single form with no variation in intensity, no periodization, no recovery. She was pushing herself to the point of failure every single day. That meant her nervous system had long since burned out. Her muscles weren't growing. Her technique wasn't improving. She'd been treading water for years, thinking she wasn't trying hard enough. But in reality, she was trying too hard. A classic case of overtraining. He'd seen this hundreds of times. He needed to talk to her. But how? The donor's memory was crystal clear. In the 3 years they'd lived together, Seo Dae-Hyun and Songhwa I-Seul had exchanged at most 100 phrases. She'd bring him food. He'd thank her. She'd sometimes ask if he was in pain. He'd say no. That was it. He was a burden to her, a harmless, quiet burden she protected out of a sense of duty. If he suddenly started talking about her technique, her training, or her body, she'd think he'd gone mad. Or worse, she'd decide he was trying to boss her around, and the heiress of a destroyed clan would not tolerate being told what to do by an empty vessel. He needed a different approach. He sat by the stream until noon. He wrapped the fish in a leaf and hid them under a rock. He'd cook them in the evening if he could find a place to do so. He returned to the estate. In the courtyard, the outer disciples were training. Elder Seo Chang-min stood in the center, watching as the disciples practiced their sword forms. Daniel stopped in the shadows by the wall and began to watch. His professional interest proved stronger than his caution. What he saw was both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because the sword-fighting forms were complex and spectacular. Wide swings, spins, jumps. Terrifying because, From a biomechanical standpoint, 90% of the energy was wasted into the air. The swings were too long. The strikes came from the shoulder rather than the torso. Their stances were too wide, which killed their mobility. None of these students used hip rotation. None of them worked from their center of mass. They were swinging their swords with their arms, like bats. Daniel looked at Park Tae-Hyun. The guy was strong, muscular. His strikes were powerful by local standards, but he was losing 30% of his power on every swing because his front foot was turned outward. A simple foot adjustment would have increased his strike speed by 20%, but no one noticed this, because no one was looking at their feet. Everyone was looking at the sword. Seo Chang-min walked among the students and occasionally struck the hands or legs of those he thought were doing it wrong with a stick. Without explanation, just a blow. The student would wince and try to figure out what was wrong. Sometimes he guessed right. More often than not, he didn't. He'd get hit again. Daniel clenched his teeth. He'd seen coaches like this before. The kind who can't explain things and hide their incompetence behind aggression. The kind who think fear and pain are motivation. The kind who produce not masters but traumatized people with learned helplessness. And this was the elder, the mentor, a man who determines the fates of his students. A sound. To the right. Daniel turned his head. At the far end of the courtyard stood I-Seul. She, too, was watching the training. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her face was impassive. A mourning ribbon fluttered slightly in the wind. She stood apart from everyone else. Not among the students, not next to the elder. Alone. Daniel noticed something. Her left shoulder was slightly higher than her right. Hypertonicity of the upper trapezius. That very same compensatory movement he'd seen that morning during formation. This wasn't from a single training session. It was chronic. Possibly the onset of shoulder impingement. If she continued at this pace, in 6 months her arm would start to go numb when she raised it above eye level. In a year, she wouldn't be able to hold a sword. She needed help, and she had no idea. That evening, Daniel found a rocky nook behind the stables where someone had apparently built a fire before. The coals were old, but the spot was suitable. He gathered some dry branches. He started a fire with flint and tinder, recalling what Dae-Hyun had taught him. His hands wouldn't obey him. His fingers were weak and clumsy. It took him half an hour to strike a spark, but he managed it. He cooked the fish in a clay shard he'd found in a pile of trash behind the stable. 3 tiny fish in murky water. Not soup. A parody of soup, but it was protein. He drank the broth and ate the little fish, bones and all. His body devoured the food with a greed that frightened him. His stomach twisted. Then it eased. Then warmth spread throughout his body, just like that, step by step. He lay down on the mat, closed his eyes, began to breathe. Inhale for 4 counts. Exhale for 8 counts. Inhale for 4 counts. Exhale for 8 counts. His body resisted. Every muscle was clenched tight. But his breathing was working, slowly. Gradually. On the 20th cycle, his shoulders relaxed. On the 30th, his jaw loosened. On the 40th, he fell asleep. For the first time in as long as Dae-Hyun could remember, he slept for 5 hours straight, without waking up, without nightmares. The morning of the 3rd day. He woke up before dawn. His body still ached, but a little less. 5 hours of sleep had done more than all the elixirs Dae-Hyun had never received. He got up and walked to the window. She was already in the courtyard, sword in hand, stance, strike, return, strike, return. Daniel was counting. On the 50th repetition, he saw the problem even more clearly than yesterday. It wasn't the shoulder, or rather, it wasn't just the shoulder. The problem started with the foot. Her back foot would slip 2 or 3 centimeters when she pivoted on the strike, every single time. Because of this, her hip didn't rotate fully. Because the hip didn't rotate fully, the torso didn't rotate fully either. Because of the torso, the shoulder compensated by pulling the sword with the deltoid instead of transferring the momentum from the latissimus dorsi. She was creating the form with her arm, but the movement was supposed to flow from the ground through the leg, through the hip, through the torso, and into the blade. One small adjustment of the foot, just one, and her entire kinetic chain would fall into place. He watched as she finished her 200 repetitions. He watched her hands tremble, her shoulders rise, her face harden. She finished, leaned on the sword, exhaled. Daniel left the room. He walked quickly, as much as her battered body would allow. He stepped out into the courtyard. She was still there. She was sheathing the sword. He stopped 10 paces away. She looked up. She looked at him. Dark eyes, calm, indifferent. She saw a husband she had to put up with, nothing more. Daniel said one word, "Wait." She looked at him. Daniel stood 10 paces away and felt the body of its former owner trying to do what it always did. Lower his eyes, hunch over, make himself smaller. He wouldn't let it. He straightened up as much as he could. His lower back ached, his ribs ached, but he stood straight and looked her in the eyes. She didn't say a word. She just waited. A commander's habit. Not to ask questions when a subordinate is already expected to explain why he's there. Daniel stepped closer. He stopped at arm's length. He could see that she had tensed up, barely noticeable. Her left hand moved slightly toward the sword. A reflex. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of the unexpected. He said quietly, "The sword. Give me the sword for a minute." Her eyebrows twitched slightly. It was the only emotion she allowed herself to show. Dae-Hyun was asking for the sword. An empty vessel who, for 3 years, had shown not the slightest interest in anything other than survival, was suddenly asking for a weapon. She could have refused. She could have simply walked away. But something stopped her. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the fact that she was used to this man never asking for anything, and if he suddenly did, it meant there was a reason. She pulled the sword from its sheath and held out the hilt. A wooden training blade, light, worn. Daniel took it. His hand could barely hold it. His grip was weak. His wrist was thin. But he didn't need defense. He turned sideways to her. He assumed the stance he'd seen from the window. He placed his back foot just as she had. Then he slowly began to move. A turn. His hip. His torso. His shoulder. A strike. Slowly and clumsily. Without power, without beauty, without skill. He didn't know how to handle a sword. That was obvious. But he made a single movement, and there was something else in that movement. He stopped, returned to the stance. Now he shifted his back foot slightly, 2 centimeters inward. He turned his foot so that it stopped slipping, and he repeated the same movement, the same clumsy, slow form. But his hip turned. His torso followed his hip. His shoulder relaxed, and the strike, albeit weak and clumsy, took a different trajectory, faster, cleaner, lighter. He turned toward her and held the sword out again. He said quietly, "I don't know your sword. I don't know anything about swords at all. But try it this way, just once. Just try it." She took the sword. She looked at him. For a few seconds. He held her gaze. Then she assumed a fighting stance. Daniel noticed that she had placed her back foot as usual, old muscle memory. He said quietly, "Foot, slightly inward." She looked down, adjusted it, 2 centimeters, and she struck. The sword followed its trajectory, the sound through the air. Another sound. Not the one she'd made 200 times in a row before. Sharper, denser. She froze. She stood there for a second, 2, 3. Then she slowly turned toward him. He saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not warmth, not gratitude. A question. A huge, burning question that she didn't ask out loud, but which was etched into every line of her face. "How do you know that?" She said only one thing. "It's easier. Much easier." "Why?" Daniel shrugged. He said he didn't know. He said it just seemed more comfortable that way. the most important lie he had ever uttered. Because if he'd explained to her about the kinetic chain and hip rotation and the principle of transferring momentum from the foot through the body to the blade, she wouldn't have believed him. An empty vessel can't know such things. But a fool who happened to notice something, that she could accept. She stood there looking at him for a long time. Then she sheathed her sword. Once she turned and walked away. She didn't say thank you. She didn't nod. She just left. Daniel wasn't offended. He hadn't expected thanks. He was waiting for evening. And that evening, what he had subconsciously hoped to feel ever since that first morning finally happened. He was sitting on a mat in his little room, doing breathing exercises. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 8. And on the 6th cycle, something clicked in his chest. Not loudly. It didn't hurt. It was as if a door that had been pushed against for 7 years had finally given way by a millimeter. Warmth. Tiny. The size of a pea. Somewhere behind his breastbone. The first seal. It hadn't opened. No. It had cracked. Just a tiny bit. A hairline crack in a wall that had stood for 7 years. He froze. Held his breath. Tried to feel it again. The warmth flickered and vanished. He sat there for an hour trying to bring the sensation back, to no avail. But he knew. He knew for sure. It was connected to her. He'd been watching her train for 2 days. Once, he'd walked over and adjusted one detail. And the seal, which had been dormant for 7 years, showed its first crack. A coincidence. Or maybe not. He went to bed and thought. If it wasn't a coincidence, then there was a connection. A connection between her training and his growth. If that was true, then the rules change. He can't train on his own. For 7 years, Dae-Hyun's body had shown no response to physical exertion. But if her work somehow opens doors for him, then his task isn't to work out. His task is to train her, to make her stronger, smarter, more effective, and to test his hunch. The morning of the 4th day. He was standing by the window again. She was in the courtyard again. Form, strike, return. But today something had changed. He saw it. She had positioned her back leg differently, just as he'd shown her yesterday. And she hadn't just positioned it differently, she'd restructured the entire movement. Her hip was rotating fully. Her torso followed her hip. Her shoulder was lower and more relaxed. The form sounded different. Not a strained whistle, but a tight, cutting sound. She'd figured out the next step on her own. She'd taken 2 centimeters of her foot's length and, overnight, used that to rebuild the entire mechanics of her strike. Talent. Pure, instinctive, physical talent. No one had ever simply given her the right guidance. Daniel smiled and felt the warmth in his chest again. A little stronger than yesterday. The crack in the seal had widened. He clenched his fist. Okay, not a coincidence. She's training correctly. He's growing. The connection exists. The question, why? And a more important question, what are the conditions? He spent the next few days conducting the experiment. On the 5th day, he approached her again after her training session. This time, he just stood nearby and watched. She glanced at him but didn't shoo him away. On the 6th day, he said he'd noticed that her left arm trembled more than her right after training. He asked if her shoulder hurt. She replied briefly, "No," and walked away. But Daniel saw her touch her left shoulder with her hand for a moment, unconsciously. It hurts. It hurts like hell. She's just gotten used to it. On the 7th day, he took a chance. He approached her after practice and said he'd had a dream. A strange dream. His grandfather on his Seo side was supposedly a healer, and in the dream, he'd shown him how to relieve tension in his shoulders after sword training. Nonsense, of course. Dreams are just dreams. But if she wanted him to, he could try. She looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she said he could do whatever he wanted. She didn't care. That was her permission. A cold, indifferent, and somewhat twisted kind of permission. But permission nonetheless. He asked her to sit down. She sat on a stone bench against the courtyard wall. straight as a sword, tense. He stood behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders. She flinched. He froze. He waited. She exhaled and froze. Daniel got to work. 20 years of post-workout massages, thousands of shoulders, thousands of necks, thousands of knotted trapezius muscles. He knew this terrain as well as a surgeon knows the operating field. The upper left trapezius was as hard as a rock, a knot the size of a walnut. The supraspinatus muscle was taut to the limit. The long head of the biceps was knotted. The subscapularis muscle was spasmed. He worked slowly, carefully. He didn't press too hard. I-Seul's body was stiff from chronic tension, but beneath the muscles he could feel a structure that, with proper care, could be magnificent. Her bones were broad for a woman. Her ligaments were dense. Her muscle fibers were long. It was the body of an athlete, a true athlete, one that had been misused for years. He worked for 10 minutes, in silence. She sat motionless. Then he sensed it. Her shoulders dropped. Half a centimeter. A centimeter. The tension began to ease. She exhaled. A long, slow exhale. Uncontrolled. Her body was relaxing against her will. When he finished, she sat motionless for 30 seconds. Then she stood up. She turned to face him. Her face was just as stony as before, but in her eyes, confusion. A brief, fleeting moment of confusion that she immediately suppressed. She said that next time, if he had another useful dream, he could try again. And she left. Daniel stood alone in the courtyard and smiled. It was a victory, a tiny one, the size of those 2 centimeters of her foot, but a victory. He'd gained access to her body, not as a husband, as someone who could ease her pain. That was enough for a start. That night, the warmth in his chest pulsed steadily and confidently. The crack in the seal grew wider. He went to bed and, for the first time ever, thought that maybe he could do it. Not escape, not just survive, but do something real. The end of the first week brought a new problem. Elder Seo Chang-min announced that the monthly review of external students would take place in 3 days. Every student must demonstrate the basic form and undergo a meridian check. Those who show no progress will face punishment. From the donor's memories, Daniel knew that the evaluations were Dae-Hyun's nightmare. For 7 years in a row, he had stepped into the center of the courtyard. For 7 years in a row, his meridians had shown 0. For 7 years in a row, the rod came down on his back in front of everyone. Public humiliation, a ritual to remind him of his place. Before, Dae-Hyun could only endure it. But now, Daniel was in this body. And Daniel wasn't going to stand there and take it. He couldn't reveal the open seal. The crack in the first seal was so fine that none of the inspectors would notice it. But he could do something else. He could show the form. Not a flawless one, not a masterful one, but good enough for the staff to pass him by. He'd spent 2 days studying the Seo clan's basic form. The donor's memory contained the movements. His hands remembered the sequence. His body knew where to place his feet and where to lead the sword. Dae-Hyun had repeated this form for 7 years. He'd practiced it poorly. He'd practiced it in fear. He'd practiced it while expecting a blow. Daniel broke down the form joint by joint. 32 movements. He mentally went over each one. Not as a fencer, as a biomechanics expert. Here, the elbow strays too far from the body. If he brings it closer, the movement will become more compact and stable. Here, the transition from one stance to another involves a full weight shift to the front leg. That's dangerous for the knees. If he keeps 30% of his weight on the back leg, the transition will be smoother and faster. Here, the rotation of the hand puts too much strain on the wrist. If he initiates the rotation from the forearm, the load will be distributed across the entire lever. Minor adjustments, invisible to the eye, but each one eliminated a loss of energy. The day of the demonstration. The courtyard was full. The outer circle students stood in a row. Elder Seo Chang-min sat on a stone bench with a staff on his lap. Next to him were 2 other elders. Daniel spotted I-Seul. She was standing off to the side by the wall, watching. The students stepped forward one by one. They performed the form. The elders checked their meridians by placing a hand on their backs. They nodded or shook their heads. Park Tae-Yeon stepped forward third. His form was confident, rough around the edges but powerful. The elders nodded. The first seal was stable. Park returned to the line with a satisfied smirk. One by one, the students underwent the test. The average ones received a nod. The weak ones received a blow with a stick. One 15-year-old boy received 3 blows and could barely stay on his feet. Daniel watched and kept count. Out of 10 students, 6 had the first seal. 2 had the second. 2 had no seals. And him, 0. His name was called last. Dae-Hyun. He stepped into the center. The courtyard fell silent. Not out of respect, out of anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. An empty vessel would step forward. He would display a pitiful form. He'd get beaten with a stick. Entertainment. Daniel took a wooden sword from the rack. He assumed the starting position. He took a breath and began. 32 movements, slowly. He deliberately didn't speed up. He wasn't trying to impress, but every movement was clean. Elbow close to the body, weight distributed evenly, rotation from the forearm, smooth transitions, not a single gesture, not a single loss of balance. The form was simple, basic, beginners, but it was correct. For the first time in 7 years, Seo Dae-Hyun performed the basic form without a single major mistake. The courtyard was silent. Not because they were impressed, because they didn't understand what they were seeing. The good-for-nothing who for 7 years couldn't get through the form without stumbling suddenly performed it smoothly. Not beautifully, not powerful, but smooth. Elder So Chang-min slowly stood up. He approached. Daniel stood straight, arms at his sides, sword in his right hand, blade pointing down. Calm. So Chang-min placed his palm on Daniel's back, between his shoulder blades, checking the meridians. Daniel felt a stranger's ki. It entered his body like cold water. It flowed through the channels. The meridians were silent. The crack in the first seal was too thin, invisible. To any observer, the picture was the same as before. An empty vessel, 0. So Chang-min withdrew his hand. He looked at him. There was something new in the elder's eyes. Not surprise, suspicion. An empty vessel cannot improve form. Form depends on muscle memory and coordination. Coordination depends on the nervous system, and the nervous system depends on qi. If there is no qi, then there can be no improvement. So the theory went. And here, theory was law. The elder said that the meridians were still empty. He said it loudly so that everyone could hear. Then he paused and said that the form was acceptable, without a single blow. For the first time in 3 years, Seo Dae-Hyun left the review without any bruises on his back. Park Tae-Yeon stared at him with his mouth agape. The other students exchanged glances. I-Seul. Daniel caught her gaze for a second. She wasn't smiling. She didn't nod. But he saw it. She had noticed. That evening she came to him, not to his room, to that corner behind the stable where he was cooking fish. He didn't hear her approach. He turned around and she was standing 3 steps away. She fell silent. Then she asked. She asked where he'd learned to move like that. Daniel thought for a second. Then he answered honestly as he could. He said he didn't know. He said that after the last beatings, something had changed in his head, as if something had shifted, as if he'd started to see the body differently, his own and others, to see where the movement was right and where it faltered. She looked at him for a long time. He waited. She could have decided he was lying, could have decided he was possessed by a demon, could have just walked away. She said she'd be waiting for him in the courtyard in the morning. She said that if he saw anything in her form, he should tell her. And she left. Daniel stood over the cooling bonfire and felt the warmth pulsing in his chest just a little faster. She had invited him, of her own accord, not because she'd been ordered to, not out of pity, out of pragmatism. She'd seen the results during the inspection. She'd seen that he'd improved himself, and she wanted to test whether he could improve her. Pragmatism, a warrior's cold calculation. It was better than any tenderness, because she could deny herself tenderness, but not the desire to become stronger. The next morning, he came to the courtyard half an hour before dawn. She was already there, standing with her sword, waiting. He sat down on a bench by the wall. He told her she could begin. He would watch. She began. The moon sword form, the only one left from the Songhwa clan. Daniel wasn't watching the sword. He was watching her legs, her thighs, her shoulder blades, the way she breathed. 10 repetitions, 20. On the 30th, he raised his hand. He said, "Stop." She stopped. He walked over. He said that on the 23rd movement she was holding her breath. He said that if she exhaled at the moment of impact, her power would increase and she'd expend less energy. She tried it. The strike became more powerful. 10 more repetitions. He stopped her again. He said her front arm was too high in the defensive stance. Her center of gravity was rising. If she lowered her elbow by the width of her palm, her stability would improve. She lowered it. She tried it. She nodded. 10 more. "Stop. That's enough for today." She looked at him with something resembling indignation. She said she usually does 200. Daniel said he knew. He said that 200 reps with poor form are worse than 30 with good form. He said that if she wants results and not calluses, then 30 reps with full concentration followed by a rest. She stood there. Her face was stony. Her jaw was clenched. He could see she was struggling. Her whole life had been built on the principle that more is better. Endure. Push through. Break yourself. Then someone comes along and says, "Stop at 30. It sounds like weakness, like a betrayal of the memory of the teachers who drilled proper form into her until she bled. Daniel didn't argue. He said just one thing. "Tomorrow morning, do 30 like you did today. Then rest for an hour. Then, if you want, do another 30. And compare how it feels. If it's worse, go back to 200. If not, we'll talk." He left. He gave her space to decide. He didn't pressure her. He didn't try to convince her. He laid the idea on the table and stepped back. That was what the gym in San Jose had taught him. You can't force a student to train the right way. You can show them the difference and let them choose. The next morning she did 30 reps. She rested for an hour. She did another 30, and she came to see him that evening. She said that the second set was harder than the first. She said that had never happened before. Usually, by the 100th rep, it gets harder and harder, and by the 200th, she can barely hold the sword. But today, after the break, her arms felt fresh, and every strike came easier than in the morning. Daniel nodded. He said one word, supercompensation. She asked him to repeat it. He said that muscles need rest after exercise. During rest, the body rebuilds them slightly stronger than they were before the workout. If you take the right break, the second set will be more powerful than the first. If you don't, the body just breaks down. She was silent. Then she asked how he knew that. He said, "A dream. My grandfather, the healer. He told me in a dream." She looked at him. He could tell she didn't believe in her grandfather. But he could also tell she didn't care. The result was what mattered. The explanation was secondary. She left. She stopped at the threshold. Without turning around, she said, "Tomorrow. Same time." Daniel sat in the darkening courtyard and counted. 3 adjustments in 2 mornings. Stop. Breathing. Elbow height. Plus dividing the load into sets with rest. And she accepted it all. Not with enthusiasm, not with trust, with the cold pragmatism of a warrior who sees the result and takes it. The warmth in his chest burned steadily. The seal was cracking along the fault line. Just a little more. A couple more weeks of this kind of work. And she'll open up. The second week turned his daily routine upside down. The morning belonged to I-Seul. Every dawn he sat on a stone bench and watched her work. 30 reps, break. 30 reps, break. 30. A total of 90 in the morning instead of 200. She resisted it every day. Not with words, with her gaze. She looked at him when he said, "Stop." And that look said it all. I have to do more. My teachers are dead, and if I don't push myself to the limit, then I'm betraying their memory. But she stopped, because her body was telling her something she didn't want to hear. The strikes became sharper. Her form became cleaner. Her left shoulder stopped rising toward her ear after practice. She fell asleep half an hour earlier. The result, a result she couldn't deny. Daniel added 1 correction per day, no more. He knew that information overload was just as harmful as muscle overload. The body can absorb 1 new movement per training session. 2 is already too many. 3, and the brain will start confusing the old with the new, and the form will fall apart. Day after day. Breathing during the strike, wrist position in defense, torso angle during the turn, stride length during the transition, the moment of acceleration in the final phase of the strike. Little things, tiny details that taken separately meant nothing, but together they formed a different shape. The same lunar form, the same movements, the same sequence, but within each movement, a different mechanism was now at work. More economical, more compact, more dangerous. On the 10th day of their joint training, I-Seul performed the form from start to finish, and Daniel saw for the first time how she moved at full power, without compensation, without loss, without pain. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. The sword traced its path like water over stone. No splashes, no turbulence, a pure flow. I-Seul stopped. She was breathing evenly. She wasn't gasping for breath. For the first time after completing the full form, she was breathing evenly. She looked at her hands. Her hands weren't trembling. She stood there looking at her hands, hands that weren't shaking after a form that used to exhaust them every morning. Daniel saw her face. There was something there that made it hard for him to breathe himself. Not joy, not surprise, recognition. As if she had seen in the mirror someone she had lost long ago. Herself before the massacre. Herself at 14, when the world hadn't yet burned. After practice, he worked on her shoulders. It had become a habit. Every morning after the workout, 10 minutes of massage. She would sit on the bench. He would stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, in silence. Sometimes he'd tell her to relax her neck. She'd relax. Sometimes he'd notice a new knot or spasm and work on it longer. She didn't say thank you. She didn't speak. She just sat there. But with each passing day, her shoulders would drop a little faster. And Daniel knew what that meant. Trust. Unconscious. Physical. Her body had begun to trust him. The rest of the day was devoted to survival. Fish from the stream. Daniel had gotten the hang of catching 3 or 4 an hour. He found a spot further downstream where larger fish were found. He began gathering wild herbs. The donor's memory was useless in this matter, but observing the manor's kitchen had helped. He'd seen what herbs the cook used. He found several of them by the stream. One turned out to be something like local spinach. Another was a bitter but edible green with a pungent smell. He cooked a thick stew from these twice a day. Protein from the fish, greens, broth, plus the morning porridge from the manor's kitchen. Dae-Hyun's body began to change, slowly, imperceptibly to outsiders, but Daniel could feel it. His grip had become slightly firmer. His legs didn't give out by evening. The dizziness he'd felt when standing up quickly was gone. He began to gain weight. Grams, not kilograms, but grams. His body was getting fuel and began to rebuild itself little by little. At the same time, he worked through the information. Every night before bed, he sifted through the donor's memory like an archive. He systematized his knowledge of the clans, about the seals, about Ki, about the rules of this world. The Seo clan, a middle-ranking clan, not one of the Great Seven. The collateral branch to which Dae-Hyun belonged was the weakest offshoot. Elder Seo Chang-min had been ruling this branch for 15 years. The fourth seal. By the world's standards, This was the level of a strong mercenary or a junior officer. Not the elite, but enough to terrorize disciples and collateral relatives. The main branch of the Seo clan was based in the capital and paid no attention to backwaters like Taegyeon. The Choi clan, one of the Great Seven, the strongest combat cultivators on the continent. Specialization, blade techniques, and ki suppression. They were the ones who destroyed Songhwa. Senior mentor Cho Gun-woo, the seventh seal, a legend, the one who personally led the massacre. Daniel remembered that name. The House of the Iron Claw, one of the three imperial houses, allies of the Choi clan in the destruction of Songhwa. Specialization, intelligence, and espionage. Their agents were everywhere. And if the rumors were true, then the Iron Claw's eyes were in Taegyeon as well. They were watching Songhwa's heiress. They were checking regularly to see if she was growing in power. Not yet. Everything was calm. That thought settled in his mind like a cold stone. He trained I-Seul. He was making her stronger. But every improvement was a step toward the threshold beyond which they would come for her. He had to solve a paradoxical problem. To build her strength while concealing that growth. To teach her to be more powerful while appearing the same as before. Toward the end of the second week, another event occurred. He was walking through the Taegyeon market. It was his first time leaving the estate. Technically, external apprentices and clan members were allowed to go into town for practical needs. Daniel went to buy salt. He needed salt for the fish. The Taegyeon market was noisy and dusty. Rows of stalls, fabric shops, a weapons smithy, an herb shop, a tea house, mercenaries and hunters at the crossroads. Daniel walked and took it all in. It was the first time he had seen the world beyond the estate's walls with his own eyes, rather than through the murky prism of the donor's memory. The world was alive, dirty, real. It smelled of roasted meat and horse manure. People were haggling, arguing, and laughing. Ordinary people, not cultivators. Farmers, artisans, merchants. Mercenaries with swords and axes walked among them. Junior cultivators of the first and second seals. Trash by the clan's standards. Demigods by ordinary people's standards. One mercenary caught his attention. A man in his 30s sat on the steps of a tea house, his right hand in a sling. His face was gray with blood. His partner stood nearby. The partner said they needed a healer, that the arm hadn't worked for a week, that they couldn't take on any jobs. The wounded mercenary replied that there was only one healer in Taegyeon, and he charged 3 silver coins per visit. They didn't have 3 silver coins. Daniel stopped. He looked at the mercenary's arm. The bandage secured his forearm to his chest. From the way the man held his shoulder and reflexively shielded his arm from accidental touches, Daniel could tell. It wasn't a fracture, not a tear. A subluxation of the radius or a dislocated elbow that someone had set crookedly, and now the joint was jammed in the wrong position. In his world, this could be fixed in 10 minutes. Proper traction, rotation, a click. Done. He stepped closer. Both mercenaries tensed up. A thin, pale teenager in the gray robes of an outside apprentice. No threat, just strange. Daniel said he could see that the arm was locked in place. He asked if he could take a look. The wounded mercenary grunted. He asked what the kid knew about this. Daniel didn't bother explaining. He said that if the arm didn't feel better in a minute, he'd leave and apologize. If it did, then they'd owe him a favor. The mercenaries exchanged glances. The wounded man shrugged his good shoulder and held out his arm. Daniel carefully removed the bandage. He felt the elbow joint. Just as he'd thought. The head of the radius had shifted out of place. Someone had tried to set it and had pushed it into the wrong position. The surrounding muscles had spasmed and locked the joint in the wrong position. He took hold of the mercenary's forearm. He slowly pulled it toward him, applying traction. The mercenary flinched in pain. Daniel said, "Relax your arm. Breathe." The mercenary clenched his teeth and tried to relax. Daniel pulled steadily. 1 second, 2, 3. Then he gently rotated the forearm outward. and he felt the joint snap back into place. A quiet click. The mercenary's eyes flew open. The pain that had been in his arm for a week vanished in a second. He bent his arm, straightened it, bent it again. He rotated his wrist. It worked. Everything worked. His partner stared, his mouth agape. The wounded mercenary looked up at Daniel, and in those eyes was the expression Daniel had seen 1,000 times in his former life. Disbelief turning into gratitude. The mercenary asked who he was. Daniel replied that he was nobody, an outer disciple from the Seo collateral branch. He said his grandfather had told him about the hand in a dream. The mercenary didn't believe in the grandfather, but that didn't matter. He said his name was Moon Cheol-Su, and that if the boy ever needed anything, he should find him at the tea house by the east gate. Daniel nodded and went to buy some salt. On his way back, he passed a herbal shop. He stopped. He looked at the sign. He went inside. The smell hit him right in the nose. Dozens of dried herbs, roots, and mushrooms, jars of powders, bunches of dried flowers hanging from the ceiling. A young woman was standing behind the counter, about 22 years old, of average height, dark hair tied back in a casual bun. Her hands were stained green from grinding herbs. Her face was sharp, high cheekbones. Her eyes were narrowed, like those of someone who's used to being deceived and is always on the lookout for a catch. She looked at Daniel and said that if he'd come for hangover pills, they'd run out that morning. Daniel said he needed mulberry root and dried schizandra berries. She raised an eyebrow. She asked him to repeat himself. He repeated it. She slowly took 2 small bags off the shelf. She asked what he needed them for. Daniel said it was for a decoction to treat muscle fatigue, mulberry root to reduce joint inflammation, schizandra to aid recovery after exercise. She looked at him for about 5 seconds. Then she said that people usually come here asking for something to relieve pain, but he was the first one to name specific ingredients and know why they were needed. Daniel shrugged. He said his grandfather had told him about it. She snorted. She said his grandfather must be very knowledgeable. She named the price, 2 copper coins for both little bags. Daniel reached into his pocket and realized he had no money. Not a single copper coin. Nothing. Dae-Hyun was literally penniless. He stood in front of the counter and said nothing. The girl looked at him. Then she sighed. She told him to take them. She said that a guy who knows the difference between mulberry root and willow bark can pay later. She said her name was Han Yuna, and that she has a good memory for faces. Daniel took the pouches and thanked her. He walked out of the shop. He made his way back to the estate along Dusty Street with salt in one pocket and herbs in the other. And he thought, this is how it begins. A mercenary with a mended hand. An herbalist who gave him goods on credit. 2 contacts in a single outing. 2 people who remembered his face. Tiny seeds that will sprout. That evening, he brewed a decoction from mulberry root and lemongrass, a warm, slightly bitter drink. He carried the bowl to I-Seul's room, set it by the threshold, knocked, said he'd left her the decoction for her joints. Silence behind the door. Then her voice. She asked what it was. He replied, mulberry root and lemongrass. It reduces inflammation and helps muscles recover after a workout. A pause. The door opened slightly. Her hand took the bowl. The door closed. In the morning, the bowl was sitting on his doorstep, empty. Daniel organized his knowledge of the world and realized that the intensification of I-Seul was bringing closer the moment when they would come for her. He went out to Taegyeon for the first time. He set a mercenary named Moon Cheol-Su's arm and earned his first commission. He met the herbalist Han Yuna, who lent him the ingredients. He began making decoctions for I-Seul. She accepted the first decoction in silence. The 3rd week began to change everything. Morning training sessions with I-Seul became a routine. Daniel broke her form down into 3 blocks. First block, 10 repetitions at a slow pace, control of every joint, focus on breathing. Second block, 20 repetitions at a working pace. Here, she gave it her all. Third block, 10 repetitions for speed, maximum acceleration in the final phase of the strike, then rest, then start all over again. 2 cycles per morning. A total of 80 repetitions instead of 200. Less volume, more quality. She stopped resisting on the 5th day of the new routine, because on the 5th day, she did for the first time what she hadn't been able to do for 5 years. A strike in perfect form, at such speed that Daniel couldn't follow the blade with his eyes. The sound was different, not a whistle, a pop. The air didn't part, it burst. She stood there, looking at the sword in her hands as if it were something unfamiliar. Then she turned to Daniel, and for the first time ever, her lips twitched. Not a smile, a shadow of a smile. A ghost of what might have been a smile if she'd allowed herself to smile. Daniel nodded. He said, "Good," briefly, without enthusiasm. Like a coach who sees that a student has reached a new level and knows that enthusiasm would only get in the way right now. She nodded in response. And that was their first real dialogue without words. The warmth in her chest burned steadily. It didn't pulse, it burned. A steady, steady fire. The first seal was on the verge of breaking. Daniel sensed that it would open completely any moment now. But he didn't rush it, just as he never rushed anything. Patience. Patience and a system. After morning training, he would walk into town. Every day. The mercenary Moon Cheol-Su had kept his word. He told the story of the young man from the Seo clan who had set his arm. He told it at the tea house in front of witnesses. 3 days later, Daniel's first patient arrived. A hunter with a dislocated toe. Daniel said it in a minute. The hunter paid with a copper coin. A week later, the second one came. A mercenary with chronic lower back pain. Daniel palpated his back and found what he was looking for. The quadratus lumborum muscle was spasmed on the left side. The iliopsoas muscle was shortened. The man had been walking with a pelvic misalignment and didn't even know it. Daniel had him lie down on a bench in the tea house. He worked on him for half an hour. He stretched what needed stretching and relaxed what was tight. He showed him 3 stretching exercises. The mercenary stood up and walked around. For the first time in 2 years, he was walking straight, without leaning to one side, without pain. He paid 3 copper coins and said he'd be back. Money, his first money. 3 copper coins and 1 from the hunter. 4 copper coins. At the market, that's the price of half a kilo of rice. Small change. But Daniel wasn't thinking about the amount. He was thinking about the mechanism. People came to him not because he was the best. They came because the only healer in Taegyeon charged 3 silver coins per visit. 1 silver coin was equal to 100 copper coins. Daniel charged 1 to 3 copper coins. The market. A basic economic principle. An expensive product loses out when a cheap alternative is available. He began visiting Han Yuna's shop regularly. He paid back the debt for the mulberry root and schisandra. Then he bought some more herbs. Yuna watched him with professional interest. On his 3rd visit, she couldn't hold back any longer and asked him directly. She asked who had taught him. She said he was ordering ingredients in combinations she hadn't seen in textbooks. She said mulberry root with schisandra was fine, but last week he asked for astragalus with magnolia bark and gotu kola leaves. Those are 3 different healing traditions. No one mixes them like that. Daniel thought for a second. Then he decided to take a chance. Not the whole truth. A half-truth. He said that his grandfather on his Seo side had collected recipes from different places, that his grandfather had traveled for many years and written down what worked, regardless of which school of thought it came from, that these notes came to him in his dreams, that he himself wasn't a doctor and didn't claim to be one. He was just experimenting. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she said that dreams were a beautiful fairy tale, but the result was real. She'd heard about the mercenary with the bad back. For 3 years, the man had gone from doctor to doctor, and no one had helped him. But a kid from a side branch of the family had laid him on a bench and fixed him up in half an hour. She proposed a deal. Daniel would buy herbs from her at a discount. In return, she would observe what and how he prepared them. To learn. Daniel agreed. It was more than just a discount on herbs. It was an ally. His first real ally outside the estate walls. Yuna turned out to be exactly who he'd hoped she'd be. Smart, practical, with a fundamental knowledge of local pharmacology that he lacked. He knew the principles. She knew the materials. He knew he needed an anti-inflammatory effect. She knew which 12 local herbs provided it, and in what form each worked best. They began working together in the evenings. He would come to the shop after I-Seul finished her evening stretching routine. Yuna would lock up the shop, and they would sit down at the table in the back room. He would explain what he wanted to make. She would tell him what ingredients to use. He would describe the desired effect without using terms from his own world. Reduce joint inflammation, speed up muscle recovery, help with sleep, calm the nervous system. Yuna listened and took notes. Then she selected the ingredients. Then they tested them. The first sleep tea was so bitter it made you want to vomit. The second one was sour. The third one worked. Yuna drank a test cup and started yawning 20 minutes later. She looked at him with sleepy eyes and said she'd never fallen asleep so quickly in her life. She asked what it was. Daniel replied that it was magnolia with valerian and honey. Valerian relaxes the muscles. Magnolia calms the mind. Honey raises blood sugar levels just enough for the brain to stop sending alarm signals. She shook her head. She said it was too simple. She said that doctors had been struggling for decades to perfect formulas for sleep-inducing elixirs, using rare ingredients and qi. And here it was, just 3 readily available herbs and honey. Daniel shrugged. He said that sometimes simple works better than complicated. She looked at him, and something other than professional interest flashed in her eyes. Something was warm, fleeting, quickly hidden. Daniel pretended not to notice. The 4th week, the end of the 1st month. Daniel sat in his little room before dawn and breathed. 4 counts in, 8 counts out. On the 12th cycle, the wall came crashing down. The warmth in his chest exploded. It didn't hurt. It was powerful, like a dam bursting. A hot wave surged through his chest, down his arms and into his fingers, down his legs to his feet, up his spine to the back of his head. The first seal had opened. Completely. He sat there breathing. His body hummed. Something was flowing inside him. Qi. He felt it for the first time. Not as an abstraction from the donor's memory, as reality. A warm current moving through channels inside his body. Weak, as thin as a stream, but real. 7 years of emptiness, 7 years of nothing, and 1 month of proper work with I-Seul. 30 days. If every hour of her training gave him a gain equal to 10 hours of his own, and she trained for an hour and a half a day, 15 virtual hours of his growth every day, 450 hours in a month, a year of continuous training for an ordinary cultivator. And that's even though she was training 3 times less than before, but 10 times smarter. He stood up. His body felt different, not stronger. No. The first seal is the lower limit, the minimum. But he could feel the qi flowing through his hands, how his joints had become slightly more flexible, how his spine had straightened by half a centimeter. A trifle to the world, a universe to Daniel. He knew he had to hide it. The first seal on a former empty vessel. That's a big deal. News. A reason for questions. If So Chang-min finds out, he'll start digging. If he digs, he'll find changes in I-Seul's training. If he connects the dots. No, he couldn't let that happen. Daniel decided not to show the seal during inspections. To everyone else, he remained an empty vessel. Trash. Invisible. That was his best defense. In the morning, he went out into the courtyard to see I-Seul. He sat down on a bench. She began her form. And he saw something new. Now that qi was flowing through his body, however weak, however minimal, he could see what he hadn't seen before. Her qi. Not with his eyes, with some other sense, as if a radar had turned on inside him. He saw her energy moving along the meridians in time with her strikes. He saw where the flow was smooth. He saw where it stumbled. The 3rd meridian on the right. When she turned during a strike, her ki stumbled near her liver. A tiny delay, a loss of speed for a fraction of a second. Because of it, the final phase of the strike lost about 10% of its power. He didn't know why. He didn't know how to fix it using chi techniques, but he knew how to compensate for it with biomechanics. When she finished, he walked over. He told her that she had a micro-pause in her hip rotation during the strike. He explained that if she started rotating her hip just a little earlier, the inertia of her torso would carry her through that pause without any loss of power. She tried it. The strike came out smoother, more powerful. She nodded. He returned to the bench and thought. Chi and biomechanics. Two languages describing the same body. The cultivator saw only chi. He saw only mechanics. But together, these two perspectives provided a picture that no one else had. In the evening, he went to see Yun-Ah. He told her that one of his decoctions needed to be reworked. The decoction for the joints worked well, but he needed one for the meridians, something that would help the ki flow more smoothly. Yun-Ah raised an eyebrow. She said that this was no longer just herbalism. It was healing. A different level, different pay, different risks. Daniel said he understood, but he asked, was there a herb that healers use to relax the walls of the chi channels? Not to strengthen the flow, not to open the seal, just to relieve the spasm, like how a massage relieves muscle spasms. Yun-Ah thought for a long time. Then she reached into the far corner of the shop. She pulled out a small canvas pouch. She shook a handful of dry white flowers onto the table. She said it was moon jasmine, rare, expensive. It grows only in the mountains. Healers use it to soften the walls of the meridians after injuries. But preparing it requires ki. You need a healer to infuse the decoction. Without that, the flowers are just tea. Daniel looked at the flowers. He looked at Yun-Ah. He thought. He had chi. Weak. First seal. But he had it. The question was whether it would be enough, and whether he could channel it. He had never channeled chi before. He didn't know how. But he knew how to direct his attention, how to focus on a single point in his body and relax everything else. 20 years of meditation before fights. Maybe it worked the same way. He asked Yuna to brew some flowers. She did. Daniel took the hot cup in his hands. He closed his eyes. He concentrated. He found that thin stream of ki inside himself. He drew it toward his palms, slowly, carefully. The ki moved reluctantly. It clung to the walls of the channels, but it moved. A thin stream of warmth flowed through his palms into the cup. He held it like that for a minute. He opened his eyes. The cup glowed faintly, barely noticeable. Yuna stood with her mouth open. Then she closed it. She looked at him. She said quietly, "You're not an empty vessel." Daniel looked at her, silently. She said she wouldn't tell anyone. She said she was a doctor's daughter and knew what it meant to keep secrets. She said she had questions, but they would have to wait. Daniel nodded. He trusted her. Not completely, but enough. Because without her, he couldn't move forward. And he couldn't afford to stand still. The second month began with rice. Daniel stood in the manor's kitchen at 4 a.m, cooking rice. Not the watery porridge the servants served. Thick rice, with an egg. With fish he'd caught in the stream and was now salting for later. With a handful of greens. He prepared 2 servings, one for himself, one for I-Seul. He left her serving by the threshold every morning, an hour before training. For the first 3 days, the bowl came back untouched. On the 4th day, he found the bowl empty. On the 5th day, it was empty too. On the 6th day, she came out for training, and he noticed a difference. Her skin. The grayish tint he'd seen from day 1 had become slightly warmer. Not pink, but not gray either. She was eating. Her body was getting the protein and calories it had been lacking for years. A small thing. 1 bowl of proper food a day. But for her emaciated body, it was a revolution. At the same time, Daniel began the second phase of working on her form. The first phase was about mechanics. Foot, hip, breathing, elbow, torso. The external pattern of movement. The second phase was about rhythm. The moon sword form consisted of 36 movements, 3 cycles of 12. Each cycle ended with a key strike. I-Seul performed all 36 movements at the same tempo, evenly, monotonously, like a metronome. Daniel saw the problem. A form isn't a metronome. A form is a phrase. It has a beginning, a build-up, a peak, and a conclusion. If all the movements are performed at the same speed, the energy is distributed evenly, and no single strike reaches its maximum power. But if the first 4 movements of the cycle are done more slowly, building up momentum, the next 4 slightly faster, propelling the body into acceleration, and the last 4 at maximum speed, channeling all the accumulated momentum into the final strike, then the key strike becomes 3 times more powerful while consuming the same amount of ki. He explained this to I-Seul in terms she could understand, not in terms of physics, but in terms of water. He said that a strike is like a river. If a river flows evenly, it is shallow. But if the riverbed narrows in one spot, the water accelerates and strikes with such force that it sweeps away rocks. Form is the riverbed. Slow movements are the wide part. Fast ones are the narrow part. The final strike is where the river crashes into the rock. She listened. Her face was stony, but her eyes were alive. She gave it a try. The first cycle came out choppy. The transition from slow to fast was rough. Her body wasn't used to the changing rhythm. The second cycle was a little smoother. The third, the fifth, the 10th. On the 20th repetition, she made the transition so smoothly that Daniel held his breath. The final strike of the 12th movement sliced through the air with a sound that made his ears ring. A wooden training sword, not a real blade. But the sound was as if steel were being cut. She froze in place. Then she slowly lowered the sword. She turned to face him and said, "That's how my father used to strike." Daniel remained silent. She said that as a child she'd watched her father perform this form. She said his strike sounded exactly like that. She said she'd tried to replicate it for 5 years and couldn't. And now, she didn't finish. She turned away. She stood with her back to him. Her shoulders trembled slightly. Once. Then they froze. She left without saying goodbye. Daniel sat on the bench and thought about what had just happened. He hadn't just taught her a technique. He had given her back the sound from her childhood, the sound of her father's sword. And that was more than any seal. The warmth in his chest pulsed, stronger than usual. The second seal began to crackle. The day went on. Daniel went down into the city. 2 patients were waiting at the tea house, a mercenary with a sprained ankle, a hunter with chronic numbness in the fingers of his right hand. Daniel treated the ankle in 20 minutes. He applied a splint made of strips of cloth soaked in a herbal decoction. It was improvised, but it worked. The numbness in the fingers was more interesting. Daniel felt along the hunter's arm from the shoulder to the fingertips. He found a compression point. The pectoralis minor muscle was pinching the neurovascular bundle when the arm was in a certain position. The hunter slept on his side with his arm tucked under his head. Every night for hours the nerve was pinched. The solution? Don't sleep on that side. Stretch the pectoralis minor daily. Daniel demonstrated the exercise. The hunter left, skeptical. He returned a week later with a broad smile. His fingers had come back to life. He had nothing to pay with, but he brought a bundle of dried venison. Daniel accepted it gratefully. Yun-Ah watched his growing practice with barely concealed excitement. She began asking questions, not about her grandfather, but about the method. Why did he always start with palpation? Why did he look for the cause of pain, not where it hurt, but higher or lower? Why did he insist on exercises rather than just herbal decoctions? Daniel answered cautiously. He chose his words carefully. He said that pain is a signal, not a problem. That if a person's knee hurts but the cause is in the hip, treating the knee is useless. That the body is a chain. It breaks at the weakest link, but the strain comes from somewhere else. Yun-Ah took notes. In the evenings, they would sit in the back room of the shop, and he would explain the basics to her. Without using technical terms from his world, in a language she could understand. A muscle is a rope. A joint is a hinge. A nerve is a string. If the rope is pulled too tight, the hinge seizes up, and the string rings out of tune. The goal isn't to pull any harder. The goal is to find what's causing the tension and let it go. She listened eagerly. Her eyes were ablaze. One evening, after 3 hours of conversation, she leaned back in her chair and said, "That's it." She fell silent. Then she said that this was what her father had been trying to teach her before he died. That you have to listen to the body, not break it. That healing isn't a war against illness, but a restoration of balance. He had said this, but hadn't managed to explain how. And now some skinny kid from a good-for-nothing family was sitting in her shop, explaining it to her. She laughed, a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a sob. Then she stood up and said it was time to close up. Daniel left. Halfway to the estate, he stopped. Something wasn't right. A feeling, a subtle one, like a draft on the back of his neck. He turned around. A dark street. No one was there. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Someone was watching him. He kept walking without picking up his pace, not letting on that he'd noticed anything. He returned to the estate. He lay down on the mat and thought. Who? Was it Cho Chang-min watching him because he'd suspected something was amiss after the inspection? Or was it someone from outside? The eyes of the Iron Claw. Intelligence that was monitoring Yi-Seol and at the same time tracking everything happening around her, including the strange husband who had suddenly started going out into the city and treating mercenaries. Daniel closed his eyes. He needed to be more careful, much more careful. The next morning, Yi-Seol's training. She was practicing her form in a varying rhythm, slowly, quickly, a strike. Each cycle was cleaner than the last. Daniel watched while his mind wandered elsewhere, to the surveillance, to the fact that every improvement Yi-Seol made brought her closer to the moment when she would be noticed. He needed a way to hide her growth. After training, he asked her to stay a little longer. He said he wanted to try something. He asked her to do the form one more time, but slower, weaker, like before, without rhythm, without the new mechanics, just the old form. She frowned. She asked why. He said it was important for her to be able to appear weak when necessary. He said that a warrior who cannot hide their strength is just as vulnerable as one who cannot show it. She froze. Then, understanding flashed in her eyes. She knew. She knew she was being watched. She knew her progress was being tracked. She knew that if she became too strong, they would come to finish her off. She nodded, and she performed the form. The old one, the weak one, the slow one, with the same mistakes that Daniel had spent a month correcting. She performed it perfectly. Every mistake was in its place. Every weakness was reproduced with a master's precision. She looked at him. She lifted her chin slightly. For the first time, there was no coldness in that gesture. There was something like partnership. We both know what's going on. We're both playing along. Daniel nodded. Good. Very good. Wednesday, the 2nd month. 7 weeks after waking up. Daniel sat by the stream and counted. 9 regular patients in Taegyeon. 23 copper coins in savings. 1 silver coin paid by a merchant for treatment of chronic migraines. Yuna as a partner in herbal medicine. Moon Cheol-Su and 2 other mercenaries as acquaintances who spread rumors. Yi-Seol on a steady training regimen. The first seal has been opened and concealed. The second is on the way. Not bad for 7 weeks, but it's not enough. Far too little for what lay ahead. The problem came from where he least expected it. Seo Chang-min summoned him that morning after training. The elder was sitting in his office. A stick lay on the table. A bad sign. A staff on the table meant the conversation would be serious. The elder said rumors had reached him, that Seo Dae-Hyun was going into town, that he was treating some mercenaries, that he was taking money for it. Daniel remained silent. He waited. Seo Chang-min said it was a disgrace. An external disciple of the Seo collateral branch was peddling his wares in the market like a wandering quack. What would the main branch say? What would the neighboring clans think? An empty vessel without the seal was meddling and healing. Laughter. Disgrace. He picked up a stick. Daniel did not back down. He did not flinch. He did not lower his eyes. 3 blows to the back, hard ones, full of rage. Daniel took them in silence. His body flinched but held firm. A month of proper food and sleep had done its job. He was stronger than he'd been on the first day. So Changmin lowered the stick. He said that if he heard one more word about healing activities in the city, he wouldn't stop at just the stick. He told him to get out. Daniel left. His back was on fire. His ribs were aching again. One of them had definitely cracked open all over again. He made his way to his little room. He sat down. He breathed. He thought. A ban on going into town. A ban on treating patients. This cut him off from his patients, from money, from Yuna, from everything he'd been building for 7 weeks. So Changmin could afford to do this. He was an elder. His word was law for outside disciples and distant relatives. Daniel could break the ban in secret, but that was a risk. If he were caught, the punishment would be more severe. If he were caught near Yi-Sil, she would suffer too. He lay on the mat and weighed his options. Then an idea came to him. If the mountain won't come to him, he must go to the mountain, but by a different route. The next day he found Park Tae-Yeon, the very same student who had shoved him with his shoulder and smirked. Park was sitting against the courtyard wall after practice, grimacing as he rubbed his right wrist. Daniel had been watching for 2 days and knew why. Park had been practicing a chopping strike with the wrong grip. His wrist was bending the wrong way with every strike. Tendinitis of the wrist. In a month, the pain would become chronic. In 6 months, he wouldn't be able to hold a sword without a wrap. Daniel walked over and sat down next to him. Park glanced at him. He asked what he wanted. Daniel asked how long his wrist had been hurting. Park tensed up. He said it didn't hurt. A reflex. Admitting pain meant admitting weakness. Daniel didn't argue. He said his wrists sometimes hurt too. He said his grandfather had shown him a grip technique that helps. If you want, I'll show you. Park looked at him suspiciously. Then he said, Go ahead. I've got nothing better to do anyway. Daniel picked up a wooden sword. He demonstrated the grip. 3 fingers at the bottom of the hilt. The pinky and ring finger grip it tightly. The middle finger is in the middle. The index and thumb are almost loose. When striking, the force travels through the bottom 3 fingers, while the top 2 guide the blow. The wrist doesn't buckle because the load is distributed across the entire palm rather than concentrated at a single point. Park gave it a try. He struck 3 times. On the 4th, his eyes widened. His wrist didn't snap. For the first time in a week, the strike went without pain. He looked at Daniel, with a different look. Not like he was looking at trash, like he was looking at a person who had just done something helpful for him. Daniel stood up and left. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't explain. He just showed him and left. The next day, another student approached him, a younger one, 15 years old, the very same one who'd received 3 blows with a stick during the inspection. His name was Lee Jung-ho, a quiet boy with frightened eyes. He whispered, asking if Daniel could check his stance. He said the elder beat him for it at every inspection but wouldn't say what was wrong. Daniel took a look. He found the problem in a minute. The boy was standing on his entire foot. His weight was evenly distributed, but the Seo clan's stance required shifting weight to the front of the feet. The heels should be light, ready to move. The boy didn't know this because no one had explained it to him. He was simply beaten for having a bad stance. Daniel demonstrated. Jung-ho tried it. His stance changed. It became lively, agile. The boy looked at Daniel with eyes full of such gratitude that Daniel felt uneasy. That was how the children in his dojo in San Jose used to look at him. The ones to whom no one had explained the simple things. The ones who were simply beaten for not understanding. A week later, 4 students came to see him, secretly, after the main training sessions. They asked about little things, why it hurts right here, how to hold your torso correctly, why they lost their balance when striking. Daniel answered each one, Briefly, precisely. One correction at a time. No more. He didn't know about Chang Min. The students remained silent. It was their secret. A small underground circle in the shadows of the estate. Daniel didn't treat patients in town. He treated them at home. And at the same time, he gained something he hadn't planned on. Information. The students talked in his presence. They shared news. Who had arrived in Taegyeon? What was being heard from the main branch? What rumors were circulating? Lee Jung-ho mentioned that in 2 months, an inspector would arrive in Taegyeon from the main Seo branch would arrive in Taegyeon. An annual inspection, more serious than usual. The inspector would evaluate not only the students but also the elder. If the results were poor, so Chang Min could lose his position. That explained the stick. Chang Min was nervous. He was putting pressure on the students. He was hitting them more often and harder. He was squeezing results out of them out of fear for his own position. Daniel took note. 2 months. The annual review. If the students show noticeable improvement by then, the elder will come out on top. And if the elder comes out on top, he might become more tolerant, or at least stop hitting them so often. Daniel began working with the students in a more systematic way, not as a coach, but as the coach's shadow. A hint here, a tip there. No lectures, no explanations, just minor corrections that everyone could pass off as their own discovery. After 2 weeks, 4 students had improved noticeably. Park Tae-Yeon landed a strike during practice so impressive that Seo Chang-min stopped and watched. For a long time. Then he nodded and walked on. He didn't praise him, but he didn't hit him either. For Park, that was a victory. Yuna was waiting. She sent notes through Moon Cheol-Su, short ones, cautious ones. She asked if everything was all right. She asked when he would come. Daniel replied just as briefly, soon, wait. Toward the end of the 8th week, he found a way. Lee Jung-ho went to the market once a week to buy provisions for the estate's kitchen. It was an official errand. Daniel asked him to pass notes to Yuna and pick up the prepared decoctions from her. Mal-chik agreed without asking any questions. The decoctions went to Yi-sil. She took them every evening, silently, without questions. A bowl by the threshold. In the morning, the bowl was empty. Their morning training sessions continued without interruption. So Chang Min hadn't forbidden them. Apparently, he didn't consider them significant. The husband watched his wife train, harmlessly. He didn't know that every morning a quiet revolution was taking place in the courtyard. The second seal was cracking louder and louder. Daniel felt it like a wall bending under pressure. Soon, very soon. So Chang Min forbade Daniel from going into town and beat him for practicing medicine. Daniel shifted his focus to work within the estate. He began secretly helping outside students with their techniques and injuries. He arranged for the delivery of herbal decoctions through Lee Jung-ho. He learned of the upcoming annual inspection by the examiner from the main Seo branch. The second seal was on its way. Week 9. The second seal opened at night. Daniel woke up because his body was burning. Not from pain, from qi. The stream that had been a trickle a month ago had become a river. A hot, fast-flowing river that rushed through the channels and widened them from within. He lay on a mat and breathed, slowly. In control. His body shook with a slight tremor. His muscles contracted on their own. The qi was restructuring his physiology. It lasted an hour. Then the tremor subsided. The flow evened out. The warmth became as steady as stones heated by the sun. He stood up and did what he had done with every new student in his former life. A test. The stone blocks in the courtyard. He stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. No one was there. He walked over to a small block, the one that weighed 20 kilos, the one he'd barely managed to lift off the ground on his first day. He picked it up, lifted it, above his head, easily, set it down, picked up the next one, 30, 40, he guessed, lifted it to his chest, heavy but possible, set it down. 2 months ago, this body couldn't lift 20. Now it was handling 40. A 2-fold increase, in 2 months, without a single session of his own training. solely thanks to I-Seul's training. He returned to his little room and sat down. He thought. The second seal. 2 months. An average cultivator takes 1 to 3 years to open the second seal after opening the first. A talented one might do it in half a year. He did it in 1 month after the first, and that was only because the first month was spent setting up the system. Now that the I-Seul training was well established, his rate of growth should increase. The third seal, the fourth, the fifth. Each subsequent one was harder to open than the previous one. But I-Seul was growing too. The stronger she became, the more each of her training sessions yielded. The math was working in his favor. For now. He knew there had to be a ceiling somewhere, a limit to their connection, a price that no one had told him yet. But it was too early to think about that. Morning training. I-Seul performed her form, and for the first time, Daniel saw something frightening. Her final strike in the third cycle created a visual effect. A streak of silvery light trailed behind the blade. Subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Ki enveloped the sword. The foundation of any serious technique. The first step toward what was called the art of the sword in this world. Not just a form filled with energy. Up until that moment, I-Seul had relied purely on physical strength. Powerful, fast, precise, but without ki in the blade. Now the ki was beginning to radiate outward, and that meant she had crossed the threshold. From an advanced fighter, she was becoming a master. The problem, the silvery light behind the blade. It's visible. Any cultivator with the third seal or higher would notice. If anyone saw that heiress Songhwa had begun infusing ki into her sword, rumors would reach Cho. Daniel waited until the end of the training session. He approached her and said he'd seen the light behind the blade. She nodded. Her face was calm, but a fire burned in her eyes. She knew what it meant. She had been waiting for this moment for 5 years. He said she needed to hide it. She looked at him. He expected resistance. She had been working toward this for 5 years, and he was asking her to hide it. But she nodded, without argument, without questions. She understood, better than he thought. She'd lived with this knowledge since she was 14. Every day she woke up knowing that if she became too conspicuous, they'd come for her. She asked how. Daniel thought for a second. Then he said, control. She had to learn not just to channel ki into her blade, but to regulate the amount. Full power during training, 0 in public. Like a faucet, open, close. She nodded, said she'd try. She performed the form again, slowly, with control. On the first cycle, the light flickered and went out. On the second, it didn't appear at all. On the third, it flashed again. It wasn't working. Control required practice. They spent another hour. By the end, she could turn off the light in 2 out of 3 cycles. It was inconsistent, but it was progress. Daniel said that was enough for today. He said that every morning they would work on control until she could turn the ki on and off at will. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, she said that he had changed. She said that 2 months ago he was different. He couldn't stand up straight. He couldn't look her in the eye. He was afraid of everything. And now he was standing in front of her, telling her what to do with her sword. Daniel was silent. His heart was pounding. What if she started digging? What if she realized he was a different person? She said she didn't know what had happened. Maybe a blow to the head. Maybe her grandfather's dream. Maybe something else. She said she didn't care. She said the result was there. Her sword had changed. Her body had changed. She'd slept for 6 hours for the first time in 5 years. She didn't know why and wouldn't ask. But, and here she paused. She looked him in the eyes. She said, if he's lying, if there's something behind all this that will harm her or Songhwa's memory, she'll kill him, without hesitation. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Cold, calm, absolute. Daniel nodded. He said he understood. He said she had every right. She left. Daniel stood in the courtyard and breathed. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the fact that she was so close to the truth and so far from it at the same time. He hadn't lied to her, not in the way she feared, but he had been hiding things. Hiding the connection, hiding the transfer, hiding the fact that her training was making him stronger. If she found out, he didn't know what would happen. He only knew that the connection would snap and they would both fall. For the rest of the day, he worked with his students, quietly, on small things. Park Tae-Yeon came on his own. No smirk, no arrogance. He said he wanted to ask something. His form was falling apart during the turn. He knew what he was doing wrong, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. Daniel took a look. He found it. Park was shifting his weight too early, before his torso had finished turning. Because of this, his upper body was getting ahead of his lower body, and the form lost its integrity. The solution was simple. Delay the weight shift by half a second. Let the torso finish turning, then shift his weight and strike. Park tried it 10 times, 20. On the 25th try, the turn came together seamlessly, powerful. Park exhaled. He looked at Daniel and said one sentence. He said, "Thank you." For the first time ever. The first "thank you" from the guy who had shoved him with his shoulder a month ago. Daniel nodded and walked away. That evening, lying on his mat, he counted. The second seal, the hidden one. The 4 disciples who were growing. Yi-Seul, who had begun to infuse ki into her blade. Yun-Ah, who was waiting for him at the shop. The mercenary who owed him a favor. The merchant whose migraine he had cured and who now greeted him on the street. Lee Jung-ho, who delivered the notes. The annual review in 6 weeks. So Chang-min, who was nervous. And the shadow on the street that was watching. Many figures on the board, many lines stretching in different directions. And he was in the center, skinny, weak by this world's standards, with 2 hidden seals and a head full of knowledge that no one else here possessed. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. Tomorrow he'd have to get up early again. The second seal opened. Daniel checked the increase in power. Yi-Seul began channeling ki into her blade. Daniel began teaching her to control the release of ki to conceal her growth. She noticed that he had changed and warned him that she would kill him if he lied to her detriment. Park Tae-Yeon thanked him for the first time. The 10th week, the end of the 2nd month. Daniel stood in front of the mirror in the estate's bathhouse and, for the first time in 2 months, looked at the body he now inhabited. It had changed. Not drastically, not enough for an outsider to notice, but he could see it. His neck was slightly thicker. His shoulders were slightly broader. His chest had straightened. The ribs that had once jutted out from under his skin like blinds were now covered by a thin layer of muscle. His legs, his thighs had become firmer. His calves had become more defined. This was a body that had begun to build itself, slowly, quietly, but it was building. 2 seals and 2 months of a normal diet, plus the ki that circulated through his meridians and did its invisible work, strengthening his bones. It was strengthening the ligaments. It was speeding up recovery. He was still the skinniest person on the estate, but he no longer looked like a skeleton. He looked like a skinny teenager. That was progress. Things at the estate were changing too. The 4 students had become 6, then 8. Of the 10 external students, 8 now turned to Daniel in one way or another. Not as a mentor, God forbid. Calling an empty vessel a mentor would be madness. They turned to him as the guy who, for some reason, sees what others don't. Clues. Small ones. Subtle ones. Each student thought it was his own discovery, which he had discussed with Dae-Hyun. No one knew that all 8 discoveries came from a single source. The results were accumulating. Seo Chang-min noticed. The students were improving. Their forms were cleaner. Their movements were more precise. 2 students showed signs of approaching the second seal. The elder didn't understand why. He didn't change his teaching methods. He didn't introduce new techniques. He didn't introduce additional training sessions. But the students were improving. He attributed this to his strictness. The stick works. Fear motivates. Daniel allowed him to think that way. At the same time, through Lee Jung-ho, he was exchanging notes with Yuna. She sent herbal decoctions. He sent recipes. Their correspondence grew longer and more detailed. Yuna asked questions that showed she wasn't just memorizing, but actually thinking. Once, she sent a note describing a case. A farmer had come to her with pain in his right knee. She examined the knee. Nothing. Then she remembered that Daniel had talked about chains and examined the thigh. She found a spasm in the adductor muscle. She relaxed it with a poultice. The knee stopped hurting. At the end of the note, she wrote one word. It works. Daniel read it and smiled. She's learning. Quickly. Through her, his method began to spread throughout Taegyeon even without his presence. Yuna treated her patients in a new way. Not just with herbs plus palpation plus searching for the cause rather than the symptom. Tentatively for now. With mistakes for now. But she was heading in the right direction. The 11th week brought an event that Daniel had both been waiting for and dreading. I-Seul came to him that evening. Not just to the doorway, into the room. For the first time ever, she stepped into his little room. He was sitting on a mat, mending his only pair of shoes. She walked in without knocking. She stood by the door. He looked up. She was holding something small in her hands, a cloth bundle. She placed it on the floor in front of him. He unwrapped it. A pastry. A small rice pastry filled with bean paste. Warm. Fresh. She said the cook had made them for the elder. She'd taken one, for him. Daniel looked at the dumpling, then at her. She stood by the door and didn't look at him. She was staring at the wall. Her face was stony. But her ears were red. He could see it. The tips of her ears were red. She was embarrassed. Songhwa I-Seul, the heiress of a destroyed clan, a woman with a sword and a stony face. She was embarrassed because she'd brought her husband a pastry. Daniel said thank you, quietly, simply. She nodded and left, quickly, almost running. He sat there holding the pastry in his hands, warm, soft, so small and yet so huge at the same time. He ate it slowly, every bite. And he realized that this was the first time she'd given him something not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. In the morning, at practice, he noticed another change. She arrived earlier than usual, 10 minutes early, and when he sat down on the bench, she turned her head slightly in his direction. She didn't look at him, she just turned her head. She made sure he was there, and she started her routine. She needs him, not as a husband, not as a man, as the one sitting on the bench who sees her, sees what she's doing, sees where she's making mistakes and where she's making breakthroughs. In her entire life since the massacre, no one had ever sat there and watched. Her teachers had been killed. Her mother had been killed. Her father had been killed. She'd been alone with her sword for 5 years, practicing her form into the void, for the dead. And now someone was sitting on the bench, alive, and watching. Danny understood the weight of this moment, and he feared it, because the closer she let him get, the more terrifying the thought became that one day she would learn the truth, that he wasn't Dae-Hyun, that the connection existed, that his growth depended on her sweat. The training continued. Daniel introduced the 3rd stage of form training. The first was mechanics. The second was rhythm. The third was space. He noticed that I-Seul was practicing her form while standing in one spot. Strike, return, strike, return. Her feet moved, but her body remained in one place. That doesn't happen in a real fight. The opponent moves, the battlefield changes. You need to be able to perform the form while moving. Forward, backward, to the side, in a circle. Daniel began placing stones in the yard, 3 stones in a line. She had to perform the sequence while moving from the first stone to the second, then from the second to the third, and then back again. Each strike at a different point, each turn with a step. At first, she stumbled. The form that had been perfected while standing still fell apart in motion. Her feet got tangled up. Her rhythm faltered. Her ki wavered. On the third day, she stopped stumbling. On the fifth, she began to move smoothly. On the seventh, Daniel added a fourth stone, a fifth, a sixth. The pattern of stones grew more complex. She had to maneuver between them, maintaining the form without interruption, as if fighting an invisible opponent who never stood still. The result was striking. In a week of spatial training, her combat effectiveness had grown more than in the entire previous month. She began to see combat not as a series of strikes, but as movement through space. The sword became an extension of her step. Her step became an extension of her breath. Her breath became an extension of her intent. Daniel watched and saw how a student who merely repeated the form was transforming into a fighter who lived within the form. The difference between someone who knows a strike and someone who is the strike. On the 13th day of spatial training, she completed the full pattern of 8 stones, 36 movements of the form, 8 changes of direction. Not a single stumble, not a single extra step. She kept the silvery light behind the blade at 0. Complete control. She stopped at the end of the pattern. She stood calmly. Her breathing was even. Her hands did not tremble. Sweat on her forehead, but no exhaustion. The fatigue of hard work. The right kind of fatigue. She turned to him and spoke. She said she was ready. Daniel asked what for. She said there would be a martial arts fair in Taegyeon in 2 weeks, a small tournament for local clans and mercenaries. Nothing serious, but representatives from the younger Cho lineages would be there. She wanted to compete, to test herself. Daniel was silent. It was too soon, way too soon. 3 months of training. She was strong, much stronger than she looked. But a tournament meant publicity. It meant eyes, a lot of eyes. She said she knew what he was thinking. She said she wouldn't show her ki. She wouldn't reveal the new mechanics. She'd fight using the old style, slow, heavy. She'd win by the bare minimum, to make it look like she barely scraped by. Daniel thought, she's right. A controlled demonstration. Show just enough not to arouse suspicion. Show that she can hold her own, but nothing more. This would give her real combat experience. It would provide feedback that no stones in the courtyard could ever give. And if she did it right, the observers will note it in their report. Songhwa's heiress, weak, not a threat. He nodded. He said they would train. 2 weeks, every day. Not technique, tactics. How to win while looking like a loser. She tilted her head slightly, and something twitched at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, a sign of agreement. They began to prepare. 2 weeks until the tournament. Daniel completely changed the schedule. Mourning, form with stones, but now he added an element that hadn't been there before. He stood in the pattern himself, not with a sword, without a weapon. He simply stood and moved. She had to guide the form around him, not to touch him, not to lose her rhythm, to feel him as an obstacle that breathes and moves. He was a poor opponent, slow, clumsy. The second seal gave him the body of a strong teenager, but nothing more. Against a third seal cultivator, he was a punching bag. But he didn't need to fight. He needed to be a body in space, a living body that moved unpredictably. For the first 2 days, she kept hitting him with her sword, a wooden one. It didn't hurt him, but it was frustrating for her. She'd stop every time, clench her teeth, and she'd start over. On the 3rd day, she stopped grazing him. On the 5th, she began to flow around him like water flows around a stone. Daniel could see that her body had learned to read another's presence, not with her eyes, with her whole body. That was what distinguished a fighter from someone who merely went through the motions. The sense of a living opponent. At the same time, he was working on his tournament strategy. Information from his students and from Moon Cheol-Su was coming together to form a picture. The small Taegyeon tournament, 8 fighters, 4 first-round bouts, 2 semifinals, the final. The opponents were mostly mercenaries and junior students from minor clans. Their levels ranged from the 2nd to the 4th seal. One representative from the junior Cho clan, Cho Sung-min, 21 years old, 3rd seal. An average fighter by Cho standards, but for a small tournament, that's a lot. He'll most likely make it to the final. If I-Seul reaches the final, she'll face him. And it will be the first time she crosses blades with someone who bears the surname of her family's killers. Daniel knew this was dangerous. Not physically, emotionally. 5 years of hatred, 5 years of nightmares, and now, standing before her, was a man with the Cho crest on his chest. Control. Everything depended on control. He'd spoken to her about it that evening after training. Straightforwardly. No beating around the bush. He said that Cho would most likely be in the final. He said she needed to decide in advance how she would feel when she saw the crest. I-Seul was silent for a long time. Then she said she wouldn't feel anything. She said that feelings were a luxury she'd save for later. Right now, she was a fighter in the tournament. That was all. Daniel nodded. He didn't believe her, but he allowed her that lie. The last week before the tournament, he shifted his focus. No new techniques. No new adjustments, just repeating what was already there. Reinforcement. The body had to forget that there was a new mechanics and an old one. Only one thing was to remain. Movement. Automatic. Deep. Hammered into the muscles so that the mind could focus on tactics while the body worked on its own. He had her run through the stone pattern until she began to perform the form with her eyes closed. Literally. He blindfolded her with a strip of cloth and asked her to walk the pattern. She did, without a single stumble. The stones remained in place. The form resonated. Ki was silent. Complete control. She removed the blindfold and looked at him. There was something new in her eyes. Not a question. Not suspicion. Confidence. Quiet. Deep. The confidence of someone who knows they're ready. Daniel saw it and felt a pang of bitterness. Not for himself. For her. Because she was ready for the tournament, but not ready for what would come after. Tournament day. The martial arts fair in Taegyeon. The square in front of City Hall was packed with people. Merchants, mercenaries, farmers, junior cultivators from the surrounding clans. A wooden platform in the center, 3 steps by 3. Stepping outside the boundaries meant defeat. The judge, an old mercenary with the 6th seal and a scar across his entire face. 8 fighters were registered. I-Seul had signed up under the name So I-Seul, her husband's surname, not Songhwa. A precaution, but still risky. Those who were watching recognized her face. Daniel stood in the crowd, not near the platform, in the 3rd row. Next to him were Lee Jung-ho, who had tagged along, and Park Tae-Hyun, who had come on his own and pretended it was a coincidence. I-Seul's first fight. Her opponent, a mercenary from the 2nd seal, a burly man with an axe. She stepped onto the platform. White training clothes, a mourning ribbon, a wooden sword, a substitute for a real weapon in the tournament. The mercenary looked at her and smirked. A girl with a stick. Funny. The referee gave the signal. The mercenary stepped forward, swung his axe, and a second later was lying on the planks. He didn't understand what had happened. The spectators didn't understand. Daniel understood. She had used the first movement of the form, the simplest one, stepping out of the line of attack. A step to the left, a turn, a strike to the wrist. The mercenary dropped his axe because of the pain in his hand. She finished him off with a jab to the chest. That was it. Quick, clean, too clean. Daniel clenched his teeth. She was supposed to look weaker. She was supposed to drag out the fight, break a sweat, show some effort. But she finished it in a second because the mercenary was so far below her level that her body reacted automatically. She realized that too. He could see it on her face. A fleeting shadow. A mistake. She stood up, bowed, walked off the platform, found him with her eyes in the crowd. He gave a slight shake of his head. She gave a slight nod. She understood. The second match, the semifinals, A student of the Baek clan, third seal, spear. A young man in his 20s, fast, skilled. A serious opponent by tournament standards. I-Seul stepped onto the platform, and Daniel saw that she had adjusted her stance. A different look, a different stance, slightly narrower, slightly more tense. She was acting, pretending to be a fighter who was nervous facing a strong opponent. The fight began. Spear against sword. The Baek clan disciple was good. Quick jabs, long-range attacks. He was pushing her toward the edge of the platform. She retreated, parried, dodged. It looked as if she was barely holding her own. Daniel saw the truth. Every parry was precise. Every step back was controlled. She was leading him, letting him get closer, forcing him to attack more often. The spearman was losing energy, while she was conserving hers. 3 minutes in, he made a mistake. He overreached slightly on a lunge. She stepped to the side and struck the spear's shaft. The blow hit the exact point of balance. The spear flew out of his hands. She pressed her sword to his throat. It was over. The fight had been grueling. 3 minutes of intense back-and-forth exchanges. She was breathing heavily. She wiped the sweat from her brow. She was limping slightly on her left leg. The limp was fake. Daniel could tell. The spectators couldn't. She walked off the platform. The crowd was buzzing. Not bad. Not bad for a woman. That was the level of the commentary. Daniel was waiting for the final. The final was scheduled for an hour after the semifinals. Cho Song-min breezed through his half of the bracket. 2 fights, 2 knockouts. His first opponent went down from a blow to the solar plexus after 6 seconds. The second lasted a minute, but the result was the same. Cho's technique. Rough, straightforward, overwhelming. Press, break, don't let them breathe. Choi Sung-min was a sturdy guy with broad shoulders and the calm eyes of a killer. Not evil, just empty. He fought the way he worked, without emotion. The third seal and the techniques of a clan that specialized in combat suppression. For a small tournament, it was like bringing a cannon to a fistfight. Daniel found Yi-Sil behind City Hall. She was sitting on a stone step, drinking water. Her hands weren't shaking. Her face was stony. But he saw her neck. The veins were taut. Her pulse was racing. She wasn't afraid of the fight. She was afraid of herself. She was afraid of what she would do when she saw the Cho crest on his chest. Daniel sat down next to her, silently. He waited a minute. Then he spoke. He said she remembered the plan. Lose on points or win in the final seconds. Look exhausted. Don't show ki. Don't show any new techniques. She nodded. He said one more thing. He said that Cho Song-min didn't kill her family. He was a child when it happened. He carries the family name, not guilt. She turned her head, looked at him. Her eyes were dark, deep, dangerous. She said she knew, said it didn't matter. She stood up and walked toward the platform. Daniel stayed on the step. He knew he'd done everything he could. From here on, it was her war, the finale, the platform. Cho Seung-min was already standing there, a wooden sword in his right hand, the Cho clan crest embroidered on the left side of his chest, a golden claw on a black field. Yi-Sil climbed onto the platform. She stood facing him, 3 steps apart. Daniel saw the moment she spotted the crest. Her pupils narrowed. For a split second. Then they widened again. Control. She maintained it. The referee gave the signal. Cho Seung-min attacked first. As expected, a straight punch to the torso. Powerful, fast. Cho's technique. Overwhelm from the very first move. Yi-Sil moved to the left. She parried. She retreated. He pressed forward. Blow after blow. Heavy, chopping strikes that shook her arms with every block. He was physically stronger. Third seal versus her hidden level. On paper, they were roughly equal, but she was pretending to be at the second seal. That meant she was supposed to be at a disadvantage in strength and speed. She was losing. She retreated. She blocked with visible effort. Her face was tense. Her breathing was labored. Her left leg dragged slightly. The fake limp from the semifinals. She was playing her part. 1 minute. 2. He was cornering her against the edge of the platform. She clung on. The spectators witnessed an uneven fight. The strong young Cho against a tenacious but clearly outmatched opponent. 3 minutes. She was right at the very edge. One more step and she would lose. Cho Sung-min wound up for the final blow. And at that moment, she did what Daniel had been teaching her for the past 2 weeks. She didn't back away. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward, into the swing of his sword, into the blind spot between his body and the blade, where the blade couldn't reach because his arm hadn't yet completed the arc. She found herself right up against him, chest to chest. Her sword pressed against his throat from below. A quick thrust. He didn't have time to react. His swing missed, striking the air behind her. Her sword was pressed against his Adam's apple. Silence. The referee raised his hand. Victory. The crowd erupted, not with excitement, but with shock. The girl with the mourning ribbon had just defeated Cho. Not with skill. Not with strength. With cunning. With patience. Calculation. By appearing weak until she stopped. Cho Song-min stood on the platform and looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes. There was surprise. The pure, unclouded surprise of a man who, for the first time, had lost to someone he considered weaker. He asked quietly. He asked her name, her real name. She looked at him. For a second. 2. Then she said, Seo Yi-Seul, her husband's last name, not Songhwa. Control until the very end. She stepped down from the platform. She made her way through the crowd. Daniel was waiting behind City Hall. She approached him. She stopped in front of him. Her hands were shaking. Not from fatigue, from adrenaline. Because she'd stood just a step away from a man bearing the Cho crest for 3 minutes and hadn't killed him. Daniel pulled a towel he'd brought along from behind his belt. He held it out. She took it, wiped her face, her hands, her neck. He took out a water bottle. She drank. Then she sat down on a step. He sat down next to her. She said quietly, she said she'd wanted to kill him. Not Daniel. Cho Song-min. She said that when she saw the coat of arms inside, everything went white. She said she held back only because she remembered his words. He bears a surname that is not to blame. She said she hates him for those words, because they're true, and because being right hurts more than being evil. Daniel remained silent. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't say she'd done well. He just sat there beside her. 5 minutes later, she stood up. She said she was leaving. She needed to wash up and change clothes. At the doorway, she turned around. She said, "Tomorrow morning, same time." He nodded. She left. Daniel sat on the step and thought about what he'd just seen. She hadn't just won the tournament. She'd won herself. She'd held back 5 years of hatred for the sake of a plan, for the sake of a future that was more important than revenge. And she'd done it not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd decided on her own. That evening, he lay on the mat and felt the third seal was bursting at the seams. The tournament. 3 fights, 3 victories. I-Seul had fought at the very limit of her control. Her ki, hidden and suppressed, was idling. But her body was working at full capacity. And every blow she struck, every step she took, every breath she drew reverberated within Daniel as a tenfold echo. The third seal would open any day now. The 3rd month. The third seal opened 2 days after the tournament. At night, quietly, without a tremor, without a wave of heat. He simply woke up and felt that there was more space inside him. The channels had widened. His ki flowed more freely. His body had changed. He stood up and realized he was standing differently. His back was straight without effort. His legs were springy. His arms felt heavier, not from swelling, but from the density of the muscles that had grown overnight under the influence of the third seal's chi. 3 months. 3 seals. A speed that was impossible by all the laws of this world, and hidden from everyone except Yoon, who knew about the first one, and only the first one. Daniel decided it was time to expand the circle, not of revelations, but of actions. The annual review by the inspector from the main Seo branch was in 3 weeks. Daniel was preparing his students for it. Not himself, his students. 8 people whom he had been quietly coaching for 2 months. Each of them had grown. Park Tae-Hyun had consistently reached the second seal. Lee Jung-ho had finally unlocked the first. 2 others had brought their forms up to a level that So Chang-min had never beaten out of them with a stick. The result would be noticeable, and Daniel knew that So Chang-min would take credit for it. So be it. It was part of the plan. The elder would receive good evaluations at the review. The main branch would be satisfied. So Chang-min would relax. The pressure on the students would ease. The pressure on Daniel would ease. His room to maneuver increases. At the same time, what he had both expected and feared came to pass, the aftermath of the tournament. A week after the fair, Lee Jung-ho brought news. A man from the House of the Iron Claw had arrived in Taegyeon. Not a spy, an observer. A quiet, middle-aged man who rented a room at the inn and began asking questions. Who is Seo Yi-Seul? How long has she been living here? What does she do? Who does she associate with? Her husband. What does he do? Have they noticed anything strange about him? Daniel took the news calmly. He'd expected this. The tournament was controlled, but not invisible. The girl with the mourning ribbon who'd defeated Che, that had drawn attention. The question was how serious it was. If the observer had come simply to check out a rumor and make sure nothing dangerous was happening, that was one thing. If he'd come as an advance and fighters would arrive in a month, that was another matter. Daniel sprang into action. Through Moon Cheol-Su, he orchestrated a leak. A simple one. A plausible one. I-Seul won a small tournament by accident. Her opponents were weak. Chae Sung-min wasn't in top form after his trip. The girl just got lucky. Nothing special. Moon Cheol-Su shared this at a tea house in front of witnesses, as gossip, as a tall tale. People picked up on it. By the time the observer reached the tea house, the story of a fluke victory had already become the prevailing opinion. Meanwhile, Daniel asked I-Seul to train using the old form for a week. In public, loudly, intensely, showing visible fatigue. She understood without needing an explanation. She went out into the courtyard in broad daylight and practiced the form for 2 hours just as she used to. Slowly, with mistakes that Daniel had long since corrected, with trembling hands, with tense shoulders, a performance for the observer, if he was watching. And he surely was watching. 10 days later, the observer left Taegyeon. Lee Jung-ho confirmed it. The room at the inn had become vacant. Daniel exhaled. The first crisis had passed. But they would return. Every time I-Seul did something conspicuous, every time a rumor spread farther than it should. The annual review went exactly as Daniel had planned. The inspector from the main Seo branch, a man in his 50s, 5th seal, calm, attentive. He observed the students for 2 days. He checked their forms. He tested their meridians. He spoke with each one. On the 3rd day, he sat down with So Chang-min behind closed doors. Daniel couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the result. So Chang-min emerged from the office with the look of someone who'd received good news. Not beaming, satisfied, reserved satisfaction. The evaluator noted the students' progress. He praised them. He mentioned that the report to the main branch would be positive. So Chang-min took all the credit, just as expected. His stick, his methods, his strictness. The result speaks for itself. Daniel stood in the corner of the courtyard and watched. No one asked him anything. An empty vessel without the seal who, by some miracle, manages to perform the basic form passably. Nothing interesting. The examiner didn't even bother to test him. Why test someone who's a 0 anyway? Daniel allowed himself a smirk. Invisibility. The best armor in a world where everyone looks only at strength. After the inspection, So Chang-min unexpectedly summoned him. Daniel entered the office, braced for a beating. But there was no beating. The elder sat at his desk and looked at him without his usual malice. He said the examiner was satisfied. He said it was good for the clan. He said the ban on going into the city had been lifted. But if Daniel brings shame upon the clan, if people start talking about his medical activities as something serious, the cane will return. Daniel bowed and left. The ban was lifted. The road to the city was open. To Yun-Ah, to the patients, to money, to the world beyond the walls. That evening, he went down to Taegyeon for the first time in a month. Yun-Ah was standing behind the counter and froze when she saw him. Then she slowly stepped out from behind the counter. She approached him. She looked at him, and she punched him in the shoulder. It didn't hurt. It was an angry punch. She said he hadn't said a word to her for a month, except for notes. She said she was going crazy here while he was playing hide and seek. Daniel smiled. He said he'd missed her. She opened her mouth, closed it, turned away. She went back behind the counter. She grumbled that they were out of the joint remedy and needed to make a new batch. Daniel sat down at the table in the back room and felt like he'd come home. Not to the estate. Here, to this dusty shop that smelled of herbs, with the grumpy girl who'd been waiting for him for a month and pretending she wasn't. The third seal had opened. Daniel prepared his students for the annual review, and So Chang-min received good evaluations from the main branch. The Iron Claw Observer arrived in Taegyeon after the tournament. Daniel arranged a cover story and staged a deliberately lackluster training session for Yi-Seul. The Observer left empty-handed. The ban on going into the city was lifted. Daniel returned to Yuna, the fourth month. The world around Daniel was expanding with each passing day. Patients in Taegyeon, no longer just a few, dozens, mercenaries, hunters, merchants, farmers with chronic pain, small-scale cultivators with problems that no clan healer would have treated for the money they had. Daniel saw patients in the back room of Yuna's shop. She assisted him. She learned. She recorded every case. Her notebook of notes grew. The root of the problem, the method of diagnosis, exercises, decoctions, results. In 2 months, that notebook would be worth more than her entire shop. Money was coming in, not in a river but in a trickle. Yet it was steady. Daniel saved every coin. He had a goal, a blacksmith's workshop on the eastern outskirts of Taegyeon. Small, with a smoking chimney and the clang of hammers. He walked past it every day on his way to Yuna, and every day he paused for a second. Yi-Seul's sword. The wooden training blade she practiced with every morning was good for form, but not for combat. For combat, she needed steel, real steel, balanced for her new mechanics. Not a ceremonial blade with engravings, a working tool. He walked into the workshop at the end of the 4th month. The heat hit him in the face. The smell of red-hot iron and coal, the clang of metal. A young woman stood at the anvil, about 20 years old, short, broad-shouldered for her height. Her arms bare to the elbows. Her forearms were covered with small burns, some old, some fresh. Her dark hair was tucked under a leather strap. Her face was red from the heat. She struck the red-hot strip of steel with a hammer, rhythmically and precisely. A strike, a turn, a strike, a turn. Daniel stood in the doorway watching. She didn't notice him for a minute. Then she looked up. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. She asked what he wanted. Daniel said he wanted to order a sword. She asked what kind. He began to describe it. The blade's length, weight, balance, the center of gravity 1/3 of the way from the guard, the blade tapering toward the tip for quick transitions, and a cutting angle designed for both chopping and slicing rather than purely chopping. The pommel's weight was calculated to compensate the blade's length and allow for a one-handed grip without losing control. She stopped wiping her forehead. She looked at him. Then she set the hammer down on the anvil. She walked over. She asked who he was. Daniel said he was nobody, an outside apprentice, a customer. She said that in 20 years at the forge, first with her father, then on her own, not a single customer had ever described a sword like that. Everyone came and said, I want a long one. I want a heavy one. I want a beautiful one. No one had ever mentioned the center of gravity. Daniel shrugged. He said the sword was for a specific person, for a specific fighting style, for a specific body type. She narrowed her eyes. She asked who it was for. He said it was for his wife. She raised an eyebrow. Then she said that an order like this would cost 5 silver coins. At least. Daniel knew. He had 3. He said he'd pay 3 now and 2 later. She said she didn't work on credit. He said he understood. He offered something else. He noticed she was holding the hammer with a grip that put strain on her right wrist. He offered to adjust her grip, to count toward the debt. She laughed, loudly. She said a kid from a side branch of the clan was going to teach her how to hold the hammer. That was the best joke of the year. Daniel didn't argue. He asked for the hammer. She handed it to him. He took it. It was too heavy for his hands, but he wasn't going to swing it. He demonstrated the grip, the 3 lower fingers. The pinky and ring finger pressed tightly together, the middle finger in the middle. The index and thumb guide it. The same principle as with a sword. The same one he'd shown Park Taegyeon. She took the hammer back. She tried it. She struck the anvil. Once, twice, 10 times. On the 20th strike, she looked up. Her expression had changed. The smirk was gone. She said her wrist wasn't snapping. For the first time in 6 months. She said her name was Kang So-Ri. She said he would get his sword. 3 silver ones now, 2 later. It's a deal. Daniel nodded. That was the beginning. Just like with Yuna, just like with Moon Cheol-Su. Professional respect that grows from a single, precise gesture. He returned to the estate. Yi-Seol was waiting in the courtyard. Not for training. Training had been in the morning. Now it was evening. She stood by a stone bench and watched the sunset. He approached. He stood beside her, in silence. She said that today marked 5 years. He didn't understand at first. Then he did. 5 years since the night of the massacre, the anniversary of the destruction of the Songhwa clan. She stood there watching the sunset, and Daniel could see that she wasn't really there. She was there, in the burning estate, in the smoke, in the screams. A 14-year-old girl whose mother pushes her out the back door and tells her to run. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't touch her. He just stood beside her. 10 minutes, 20, half an hour. The sun set. It grew dark. She stood there. He stood there. Then she turned and went to her room. She didn't say a word. In the morning, Daniel got up earlier than usual. He went to the kitchen. He cooked rice. He added sliced pickled radishes to the rice, the very same ones. He'd spent 2 weeks looking for the recipe. He'd asked her questions, careful ones, indirect ones. "What's your favorite flavor from your childhood?" She answered briefly. "Mom's radishes." He asked more questions. "What kind?" "Salty. Sweet. Sour?" She said, "With honey and vinegar, just a little spicy, and with sesame seeds on top." He found the recipe, or rather pieced it together from scraps. He tried 4 versions. Yuna helped with the vinegar proportions. The 5th version worked. Not perfect, but close. He set the bowl on her doorstep. Rice with pickled radishes. He knocked, then he left. She opened the door, took the bowl, looked at the contents. Daniel didn't see this. He was already back at his place. But he heard it. Silence. A long silence behind the door, 2 hallways away and around the corner. And then a sound. Quiet. Muffled. She was crying. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't crying out of pain or anger. She was crying because someone had remembered the taste of her childhood. Daniel sat in his little room and listened to that sound through the walls in the distance. And he didn't move. He didn't go to her. He didn't comfort her. He let the grief happen. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. To sit and not go. That day's morning training was different. She came in with red eyes. She took her stance. She picked up her sword. and she performed the moon sword form from the first movement to the last, without stopping, without breaks, all 3 cycles, with a varying rhythm, with a spatial pattern across the stones, with ki in the blade, full power. A silvery light burned steadily and brightly behind the blade. She didn't hide it. She didn't control it. She just did it. For herself, for the dead, for her mother who used to make radishes with honey and sesame seeds. Daniel sat on a bench and watched, and he felt the 4th seal cracking inside him. Not from her training, from something greater. She finished. She stood in the center of the courtyard, sword lowered, breathing steady. She turned to him. Her eyes were wet. Her face was calm. She said one word, "Thank you." For the first time ever, the first thank you from Songhwa I-Seul for a bowl of rice with pickled radish. 6 months. 182 days since that morning when he woke up on the cold floor with strangers' hands on him and a splitting headache. Daniel stood by the stream behind the estate and looked at the water. The body he now inhabited had become different. Not large, not powerful by this world's standards, but alive. Muscles lay in an even layer across his entire torso. His back was straight. His arms were firm. 4 unsealed seals, hidden from everyone. To the world, he was still Seo Dae-Hyun, an empty vessel, a nobody, trash, a shadow behind his wife's back, and that was as it should be. The morning began as usual. He cooked rice, 2 servings. He carried them to her door. But today, the door was open. I-Seul was sitting at a small table inside. She looked up. She looked at him. And she said, "Come in." It was the first time she had invited him into her room. He entered. He set the bowl on the table. He sat down across from her. The room was bigger than his own tiny room, but just as empty. A mat, a table, a sword rack, a sword, a new one, the one forged by Kang So-Ri, a real blade in a plain, unadorned wooden scabbard. I-Seul had received it a week ago. She took it in her hands, made a single movement, and froze for 10 seconds. Then she looked at Daniel and said that this sword was made for her, not for someone like her, specifically for her hand, for her build, for her body. Daniel replied that Kang So-Ri was a good craftsman. She shook her head. She said that a master does what he's told. And he had told her. I-Seul ate her rice. Daniel ate his portion, in silence, together, in the same room, for the first time in 6 months of living together. She finished eating, set her bowl aside, looked at him, and she began to speak. She told him about that night, 5 years and 1 month ago, the fire, the screams, her mother, who had pushed her toward the back door and said one word, "Run." She ran, down the burning hallway, past bodies, past people she'd known since birth. She dashed out into the courtyard. One of the servants grabbed her and carried her into the forest. She looked back once. The estate was burning. The tower with the clan's library was burning. The training hall was burning. Her mother's room was burning. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just watched as her world turned to fire. Then there was the temple. 2 years in the temple on the mountain. Monks hid her. They fed her. They left her alone. They didn't comfort her. She practiced her form every day, the only one she remembered. 200 times. 200 times. 200 times. Because if she stopped, the fire would return and burn her from the inside out. Then came the Seo clan, the marriage contract. The boy they brought to her and told her, "This is your husband." A skinny, frightened boy with his eyes fixed on the floor. She looked at him and thought, "Another one I have to protect. One more thing I won't be able to save." She fell silent. Then she looked at Daniel. She said that everything had changed. She said she didn't know exactly when. Maybe when he set her foot. Maybe when he first put his hands on her shoulders. Maybe when she saw the pickled radishes in the bowl. But something had changed. She'd stopped thinking of him as a burden. She didn't know how to think of him now. It was scary. Daniel listened. Every word, every pause, every breath between sentences. When she fell silent, he was silent too, for a minute. Then he spoke. He said he couldn't promise her that everything would be all right. He couldn't promise that the killers would pay. He couldn't promise that he'd always be there for her. But he could promise one thing. Tomorrow morning, there would be rice, and he would sit on the bench, and he would watch. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded slightly. She stood up. She took the sword. She said, "The courtyard. Training. Let's go." They went out. He sat down on the bench. She stood in the center, and she began. The moon sword form. But not the one it was 6 months ago. A different one. The same sequence. The same 36 movements. But within each movement, a different person lived. Her foot was positioned correctly. Her hip rotated fully. Her torso guided the sword. Her shoulder was relaxed. Her breath matched the strike. The rhythm flowed from slow to fast and back again. Chi enveloped the blade in a silvery light that she turned on and off at will. Her body moved through the space, dodging invisible stones with her eyes closed. Because she didn't need her eyes. Her body knew. She was done. She stood in the center of the courtyard, sword lowered, eyes open. She looked at him. Daniel sat on a bench and realized he was looking at the result of 6 months of work. Not his work, hers. He hadn't made her strong. She had always been strong. He had removed what was holding her back. Poor form, poor training regimen, poor nutrition, poor sleep. The fear of showing weakness, the habit of confusing suffering with progress. He had removed the brakes, and she took off. On her own, with her own strength, with her talent, with her will, which had been burning inside her for 5 years and had now finally found an outlet, not in fire, but in movement. He stood up from the bench. He walked over to her. She stood steady. Her breathing was steady. Her face showed nothing. But in her eyes was that very thing. Not love. It was too early for love. Recognition. She saw him. Not Dae-Hyun. Not an empty vessel. Not a burden. Him. The person he truly was. She didn't know his real name. She didn't know where he was from. She didn't know about the bond, the seals, the transfer, or the heavenly pact, but she saw him, and that was enough. He said, "In 6 months it will be harder. The Cho clan won't forget. The House of the Iron Claw will return. We need allies. Money, people, a place beyond the reach of those who killed Songhwa." She nodded. He said he had a plan. A dojo, not a clan, not a sword school, a healing center, a place where the broken come, the overtrained, the outcasts, those whom the world has abandoned. He would mend them, get them back on their feet, teach them what he knows, and they'll grow, not for revenge, for themselves. And when there are enough of them, when each of them can stand on their own 2 feet, then it'll be possible to talk to Cho, not with a sword, with his own truth, with proof that the path of care and knowledge is stronger than the path of fear and pills. She listened. Then she said it would take a long time. She said she'd been waiting 5 years. She could wait a little longer. But she said there was one condition. She'd go with him. Not as a contract wife, as a partner. She'd train the fighters. He'd mend their bodies. Together. Daniel nodded. They stood in the courtyard. The morning sun was rising over the estate's walls. Somewhere in the city of Yuna was opening her shop and putting the kettle on. Somewhere, Kang So-Ri was stoking the forge and taking out a hammer with a new grip. Somewhere, Lee Jong-ho was practicing his stance and smiling because his feet were positioned just right. Somewhere, Park Tae-yeon was swinging his sword and felt no pain in his wrist. Somewhere, Moon Cheol-Su was twirling his once broken arm and telling a story in a tea house about the young man who had set it in a minute. Tiny seeds. That had already sprouted. Daniel looked at I-Seul. She was standing nearby. The sword was in its sheath. A mourning ribbon was in her hair, but her back was straight. Her shoulders were level. Her left shoulder was level with her right. For the first time in 5 years, he said, Tomorrow he's going to Taegyeon to look for a place, a small one, on the outskirts, with a courtyard for training and a room for patients. They'll start small. She said she'd go with him. He said okay. She turned and walked toward her room. She stopped halfway there. Didn't turn around. She said, "The rice was delicious." She left. Daniel stood alone in the courtyard. The sun warmed his face. The 4 seals hummed quietly inside him. In his pocket lay 3 silver coins and a handful of copper. In his mind lay a plan for the year ahead. In his chest lay a warmth that had nothing to do with the seals or key, just simple human warmth. The warmth that came from someone saying the rice was delicious and leaving without turning around, because turning around meant showing her face, and on her face was something she wasn't ready to reveal. He smiled. He sat down on a bench. He closed his eyes. He breathed. 4 counts in, 8 counts out. Years lay ahead. The Cho clan, the House of the Iron Claw, the mystery of the tomb in the Baekdu Mountains, the price of the pact with heaven. Songhwa's surviving disciples scattered across the continent. War, politics, tournaments, betrayals, revelations. All of this lay ahead, and he knew it would be difficult. He knew it would be painful. He knew that one day the truth would come out, and he would have to answer for his silence. He knew that one day the pact would demand a price, and he didn't know what it would be. But now it was morning. The sun hung over Taegyeon. The rice was delicious. She said thank you. And tomorrow he would sit on that bench again and watch. Watch her strike. See where she went wrong. See where she broke through. See her. That was enough. For today, that was enough. He opened his eyes. He stood up, and he went to prepare for tomorrow.